Joseph Barboza was so violent that even the Mafia called him the animal. He murdered at least 26 people, possibly more. And when the FBI made him their star witness, he sent innocent men to death row with false testimony. This is the true story of America's first Mafia informant placed into witness protection and the bloodiest hitman Boston has ever seen. Tonight, we are not entering a glamorous underworld. There are no jokes here, no loyalty codes that hold, no honor among criminals, only fear. Joseph, the animal, Barboza, was a man so uncontrollable that even hardened mobsters avoided him. A killer who didn't calculate, he reacted. A man whose violence was not strategic, but instinctive. And yet, he became the most protected criminal in New England history. Because when Barboza decided to talk, the FBI listened. They believed him. They shielded him. They built cases on his words. And in doing so, they gave a violent man the power to decide who went to prison and who never came home. Before we continue, take a moment to tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And if you enjoy calm, long-form true crime stories told in a slow, cinematic way, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss future stories like this. Now settle in. This is the true story of Joseph, the animal Barboza. Chapter 1, Segment 1. A reputation forged in fear. Long before Joseph Barboza ever spoke to federal agents, long before his name appeared in court transcripts and headlines, he was already known. Not for intelligence, not for leadership, but for something far more unsettling. People feared him, not in the casual way criminals fear rivals, but in a deeper, more instinctive way. The kind of fear that makes conversations stop mid-sentence. The kind that changes walking routes and seating choices. The kind that spreads quietly, without explanation. Joseph Barboza earned that fear early. Born in Boston in 1932, his childhood unfolded in a city already hardened by crime, poverty, and distrust. Violence was not unusual in his environment. It was normalized. But even within that context, Barboza stood out. From a young age, his behavior suggested something uncontained. Anger did not flare and fade. It settled in him. It became part of his posture, his tone, the way he looked at people. Those who knew him as a boy later described him as volatile and cruel. Not reactive, but proactive. He didn't wait to be threatened. He tested boundaries deliberately, watching how far he could go. When confronted, he did not back down. When punished, he did not soften. Each consequence only seemed to sharpen him. By adolescence, violence was no longer a response. It was a preference. Fights were frequent. Weapons appeared early. Knives, improvised tools, anything that could end a conflict quickly. He did not fight to dominate socially. He fought to hurt. That distinction mattered, though few recognized it at the time. Police encounters followed. Arrests came and went, but none of them slowed him down. Jail time did not intimidate him. Authority did not restrain him. If anything, each interaction reinforced his belief that fear was the only language that worked. Boston's criminal underworld took notice. Organized crime does not recruit morality. It recruits utility. And Joseph Barboza was useful. He did not hesitate. He did not question. He did not show mercy. For men who needed problems removed quietly and decisively, he was effective. This is where his transformation accelerated. Barboza became associated with figures connected to the New England Mafia, eventually operating within the orbit of powerful crews that valued obedience and results. He was not a strategist. He was not trusted with planning. He was brought in when something needed to be done without discussion. And he did it. Over time, the stories multiplied. Murders whispered about, but never confirmed. Beatings that went too far. Situations where witnesses disappeared, suspects vanished, and no one asked questions afterward. It was during this period that his nickname emerged. The Animal, not as a badge of honor, but as a warning. Other mobsters, men who lived their lives outside the law, began to avoid him. They didn't want him at meetings. They didn't want him nearby during business. Not because he was disloyal, but because he was unpredictable. He did not understand restraint. And in organized crime, restraint is survival. Barboza didn't just kill. He enjoyed the power that came with being feared. He used it to intimidate not only enemies, but allies. He crossed lines casually. He escalated situations that could have been resolved quietly. And yet, he was protected. As long as his violence served the interests of those above him, it was tolerated, excused, reframed as necessity. This protection allowed his behavior to intensify. Each successful act reinforced the belief that there would be no consequences. By his own later accounts, and those pieced together by investigators, Joseph Barboza would eventually be linked to at least 26 murders. Some confirmed, others suspected, many never fully investigated. But numbers alone don't explain his reputation. What made Barboza different was not how often he killed, but how little it seemed to affect him. There was no visible conflict, no chosetashchen, no signs of internal struggle. Violence was routine, almost mechanical. This unsettled, even seasoned criminals. In the Mafia, violence is supposed to be controlled, strategic, purposeful. Barboza violated that code repeatedly. He did not just enforce orders. He imposed himself. He made situations worse, louder, more dangerous. Still, no one stopped him, because stopping him would have required acknowledging how useful he had been. This is the contradiction at the heart of his story. Joseph Barboza was not an anomaly. He was the result of an environment that rewarded brutality as long as it produced results. His rise was not accidental. It was enabled, encouraged, shielded, and it was only a matter of time before that violence turned inward. Because men like Barboza do not slow down. They do not self-correct. They do not stop on their own. The same qualities that made him valuable would eventually make him dangerous, not just to enemies, but to the very system that protected him. And when that moment arrived, everything changed. This was only the beginning. Chapter 1, Segment 2, Violence Without Limits. By the time Joseph Barboza was fully absorbed into Boston's criminal ecosystem, his reputation had already begun to harden into something fixed and immovable. People no longer wondered whether he was capable of violence. That question had been answered. What unsettled them was how easily violence flowed through him, how little effort it seemed to require. Those who worked around him learned to measure their words. Conversations shortened when he entered a room. Jokes stopped. Even experienced criminals adjusted their posture when he was nearby, not out of respect, but self-preservation. Barboza did not read social cues the way others did. He did not sense when to stop. He did not recognize the unspoken signals that usually kept interactions from escalating. In the underworld, this was dangerous. Violence and organized crime was supposed to be controlled, calculated, used sparingly and with purpose. Barboza ignored that logic. He reacted emotionally. If he felt disrespected, he responded immediately. If he sensed challenge, he crushed it. There was no cooling off period. No consultation, no reflection. This is how fear spread. Stories circulated quietly. A man beaten far beyond what was necessary. A disagreement resolved with irreversible force. Someone who said the wrong thing at the wrong time to the wrong person. Names were not always spoken. Details were rarely shared, but the message traveled clearly enough. Avoid him. As his body count grew, so did his isolation. Even among killers, he was seen as excessive. Men who had committed violence for decades began to treat Barboza like a volatile substance. Useful, but dangerous to handle for too long. They relied on him when they needed intimidation or elimination, then pushed him back into the shadows. But reliance came at a cost. Barboza did not respond well to being controlled. He bristled at limits. Orders felt like insults. When he sensed he was being managed, his behavior became more erratic. He pushed harder. He took greater risks. It was as if he needed to constantly reassert his dominance through force. This created tension within the mafia structure. Organized crime depends on hierarchy, clear chains of command, predictable outcomes. Barboza disrupted that balance. He acted without permission. He escalated minor disputes into major problems. He attracted attention at a time when discretion was essential. Yet no one intervened decisively. Why? Because despite his recklessness, Barboza delivered results. Rivals disappeared. Threats vanished. Debts were collected without follow-up. For those at the top, the benefits outweighed the discomfort. As long as his violence was aimed outward, it was tolerated. This tolerance was a mistake. With each act that went unpunished, Barboza learned the same lesson again and again. Fear protected him. Violence insulated him. Consequences belonged to other people. That belief would define everything that followed. As law enforcement pressure increased across New England, the Mafia grew more cautious. Surveillance intensifie. Informants appeared. Federal attention tightened. In this environment, unpredictability became a liability. Barboza did not adapt. Instead of becoming quieter, he became more volatile. Instead of blending in, he stood out. His temper shortened. His reactions grew sharper. And his name began to surface not just in criminal whispers, but in police files. This was the first crack. Detectives began noticing patterns. Multiple crimes linked to the same presence. Witnesses describing the same man, the same posture, the same stare, the same overwhelming fear. Barboza was becoming visible, and visibility was dangerous. Within the Mafia, concerns grew. He was too loud, too reckless, too uncontrollable. He had crossed from asset to liability, though no one wanted to say it openly. Removing him would require acknowledging the role they had played in enabling him. So they delayed. Barboza sensed a shift. Paranoia set in. He trusted fewer people. He slept lightly. He watched constantly. In his world, betrayal was inevitable, and he assumed it was coming. What he did not expect was the direction it would come from. Because when the walls began closing in, Joseph Barboza did not do what mobsters were expected to do. He did not accept prison quietly. He did not prepare for silence. He did not disappear. Instead, he made a decision that would change the course of American criminal justice. He chose to talk, and in doing so, he would trade one kind of violence for another, one that didn't require weapons but words. The consequences of that choice would reach far beyond Boston, and no one was prepared for what followed. Chapter 1, Segment 3 dealt when fear turns inward. As pressure closed in around Joseph Barboza, something subtle began to change. Not his behavior, that remained violent and impulsive, but the way others responded to him. The fear he had spent years cultivating no longer moved in one direction. It began to circle back. Within Boston's underworld, men who once relied on him started calculating distance. Meetings became shorter. Invitations stopped arriving. Decisions were made without him present. Barboza noticed. He always noticed. And the realization unsettled him more than any confrontation ever had. Fear had protected him. Now fear was isolating him. This is the point where men like Barboza become most dangerous. Not because they feel cornered, but because they feel betrayed. Loyalty, in his mind, had always been enforced through intimidation. When intimidation stopped working, there was nothing left to fall back on. His reactions grew sharper. Conversations ended abruptly. Accusations surfaced where none had existed before. Barboza began testing people, pushing boundaries harder than ever, as if daring them to confirm his suspicions. They did, quietly. Behind closed doors, discussions took place that did not include him. Concerns were raised about his unpredictability, his inability to follow instruction, his growing visibility to law enforcement. These conversations were careful, measured, and deliberate. In organized crime, these are not complaints. They are warnings. At the same time, law enforcement pressure intensified. Federal investigators were no longer just tracking organizations. They were tracking individuals. Informants were quietly cultivated. Files thickened. Patterns emerged. Joseph Barboza's name appeared more often than most. He was becoming too obvious. Arrests followed. Charges accumulated. Barboza found himself facing the possibility of long-term imprisonment. Not for one act, but for many. Unlike others who prepared for silence and loyalty, Barboza did something else entirely. He evaluated his options, and for the first time in his life, violence did not offer an escape. Killing could remove a threat. Intimidation could delay consequences. But prison walls could not be punched through. This realization did not inspire remorse. It inspired calculation. Barboza began to understand something crucial. The same fear he had weaponized for years could be repurposed. If people were afraid of him, they would believe him. If he spoke, his words would carry weight. And if law enforcement needed someone to talk, he could give them stories they wanted to hear. True or not, this was not a moment of conscience. It was a survival instinct. Barboza did not see himself as betraying the Mafia. In his mind, he had already been abandoned. The distance he felt, the hesitation, the exclusion, these were signs that protection was slipping away. Talking was not disloyalty. It was retaliation. When initial contact with authorities began, it was cautious. Barboza tested them the way he tested everyone. He offered pieces, names, details, enough to demonstrate. Chapter 2, Segment 1, The Turn That Shocked the Underworld. Joseph Barboza's decision to cooperate with federal authorities did not come from reflection or remorse. It came from calculation. B. Why the late 1960s, the environment around him had shifted. The streets that once shielded him now felt exposed. Surveillance had increased. Informants were everywhere. Arrests were no longer temporary inconveniences. They carried weight, consequences, permanence. Barboza understood one thing clearly. The protection he once relied on inside the Mafia was thinning. He was no longer indispensable. Within organized crime, usefulness is a currency that depreciates quickly. Once someone becomes more dangerous to keep than to remove, their value collapses. Barboza sensed this instinctively. Meetings became colder, conversations shorter, invitations fewer. He was being edged out, paranoia followed. Barboza began to believe that his own people were preparing to eliminate him. Whether this threat was imminent or imagined mattered less than how real it felt to him. In his world, hesitation meant death. So he moved first. When federal agents arrested him on weapons charges, they expected resistance, silence, defiance. Instead, they encountered something unexpected, a man eager to talk. This moment would later be framed as a strategic breakthrough. In reality, it was chaos disguised as cooperation. Barboza did not approach the FBI with a carefully constructed confession. He arrived with fragments. Names, stories, accusations. He spoke quickly and relentlessly, offering details that seemed impossible for an outsider to know. Murders, meetings, internal disputes. The structure of the New England Mafia laid out in unnerving clarity. For agents struggling to penetrate that world, it was intoxicating. They had never seen anything like this. Barboza was not a peripheral associate. He was a participant, a killer, someone who claimed direct involvement in dozens of murders. His information promised access to a criminal ecosystem that had resisted federal pressure for decades. But there was a problem. Barboza was not trustworthy. He had built his entire life around manipulation and fear. He escalated conflict instinctively. He used violence to control outcomes. And now he had discovered a new weapon, testimony. Federal agents knew he was dangerous. They knew he was unstable, but they believed they could manage him, control him, extract the truth while minimizing risk. This belief would prove catastrophic. Barboza quickly learned how the system worked. He understood that details impressed agents, that specificity created credibility, that confidence translated into protection. And so, he gave them exactly what they wanted: stories that fit their theories, names that matched their suspicions, narratives that moved cases forward. Some of it was true, much of it was not. But in an era before forensic corroboration was standard, testimony mattered more than evidence. A convincing witness could outweigh contradictions, and Barboza was convincing. He spoke without hesitation, without emotional conflict, without visible fear. He described violence with unsettling calm, positioning himself as both insider and survivor. He framed his cooperation not as betrayal, but as necessity, a man forced to speak because his life was in danger. Agents listened. They began building cases around his words. And in doing so, they placed immense power in the hands of a man who had never demonstrated restraint. Chapter 2, Segment 2, When Testimony Becomes a Weapon. Once Joseph Barboza was positioned as a cooperating witness, the relationship between him and federal authorities changed rapidly. What began as cautious debriefings evolved into something far more dangerous: dependence. Barboza was no longer just an informant. He was becoming a cornerstone. Federal prosecutors were under immense pressure to dismantle the New England Mafia. For years, juries had been unwilling to convict powerful mob figures without insider testimony. Surveillance was limited. Physical evidence was scarce. Witnesses were terrified. Barboza solved all of those problems at once. He didn't just talk, he performed. He spoke with certainty. He named names confidently. He described crimes vividly, placing himself at the center of events in ways that sounded credible and compelling. To investigators hungry for results, his accounts felt like breakthroughs. But beneath the surface, something was deeply wrong. Barboza did not distinguish between truth and usefulness. In his mind, stories were tools. They could be shaped, adjusted, expanded, whatever was necessary to secure protection. If one version failed, another could replace it. What mattered was the outcome, and the outcome he wanted was survival. As prosecutors began preparing cases, they relied heavily on Barboza's testimony. His words became evidence. His recollections became timelines. His accusations became charges. Men were arrested not because of forensic proof, but because Barboza said they were guilty. Some of them were, others were not. This distinction was blurred, sometimes deliberately, sometimes through negligence. Barboza understood which names prosecutors were interested in. He understood which stories advanced investigations. And he learned quickly that adding detail increased his value. So he added detail. He implicated rivals. He settled personal grudges. He removed enemies not with bullets, but with sentences that carried life-altering consequences. Each accusation strengthened his position. Each successful conviction reinforced his importance. The system rewarded him for this. Federal agents relocated Barboza, protected him, and provided financial support. He was insulated from retaliation. His past crimes were set aside. Murders he admitted to were not prosecuted. In exchange, he continued to testify. This arrangement marked a turning point in American criminal justice. For the first time, a high-level mafia killer was placed into witness protection. It was unprecedented, and it set a powerful precedent, one that would be studied, debated, and criticized for decades. But in the moment, the focus was not on ethics. It was on results. Trials moved forward. Juries listened. Convictions were secured. Headlines celebrated the downfall of mob figures long thought untouchable. Barboza was hailed as courageous, despite his history. His cooperation was framed as a turning point in the war against organized crime. Few questioned the source. Defense attorneys tried. They challenged Barboza's credibility, pointing to his violence, his instability, his obvious incentive to lie. But prosecutors countered with confidence. They emphasized corroboration where it existed and dismissed inconsistencies as minor. Judges allowed testimony to stand. And so, men were sentenced. Some received life sentences. Others faced death row. Their families watched as Barboza walked free, escorted by federal agents, while their loved ones were led away in chains. The imbalance was stark. Barboza, responsible for dozens of murders, was protected. Others, accused by him, were condemned. This is where the system crossed a line. The problem was not that Barboza testified. The problem was that his testimony became untouchable. Once the FBI committed to him as a witness, acknowledging flaws in his accounts would undermine entire cases. Careers were built on his cooperation. Reversing course would mean admitting catastrophic error. So doubts were ignored. Contradictions were minimized. Warnings were dismissed. Even when evidence surfaced that some of Barboza's statements were false, the machine kept moving. It was easier to protect the narrative than to confront the truth. This was not corruption in the traditional sense. It was institutional self-preservation. Barboza sensed this shift. He realized that he was no longer just useful, he was necessary. And with necessity came leverage. He continued testifying, and the damage continued spreading. What had begun as a strategy to dismantle organized crime was quietly transforming into something else. A system where the word of violent man carried more weight than evidence, more weight than doubt, more weight than justice. And no one was prepared to stop it. Chapter 2, Segment 3, Cracks in Story. As the trials concluded and sentences were handed down, the public narrative appeared settled. Dangerous men had been removed from the streets. Organized crime, at least in Boston, seemed weakened. Federal authorities cited progress. Headlines moved on, but beneath the surface, unease lingered. It began quietly, as these things often do. A detail that didn't align. A date that shifted. A witness who remembered something differently. On their own, these inconsistencies seemed minor. Taken together, they formed a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Some defense attorneys refused to let Barboza's testimony rest. Even after convictions, they continued filing appeals, poring over transcripts, comparing statements given months apart. What they found was troubling. Barboza's stories were not stable. Key details changed depending on the audience. Locations moved. Timelines stretched or compressed. Conversations appeared in one version and vanished in another. Events that Barboza claimed to have witnessed personally were later described as secondhand knowledge. These were not the mistakes of fading memory. They were signs of improvisation. In several cases, independent evidence failed to support Barboza's claims. Alibis emerged. Phone records contradicted timelines. Physical evidence placed accused men miles away from the scenes Barboza described. Yet these discrepancies have been overlooked during trial, drowned out by the weight of his cooperation and the urgency to secure convictions. Families of the convicted began to speak out. They told stories of men who had lived quietly after leaving the criminal world, suddenly pulled back into it by accusations from a witness who benefited directly from their imprisonment. Wives described watching their children grow up without fathers. Parents aged while waiting for appeals that moved slowly, if at all. For them, Barboza was not a hero. He was a shadow that had consumed their lives. Inside law enforcement, doubts also began to surface. Not everyone involved in the cases felt comfortable with the reliance placed on a single, deeply compromised witness. Some agents quietly questioned whether the bargain had gone too far. Others worried about the long-term consequences if Barboza's credibility collapsed. But these concerns rarely made it into official reports. The machinery of the justice system is not designed for easy reversal. Once verdicts are reached, momentum carries cases forward, not backward. Admitting error would mean reopening trials, revisiting evidence, and confronting the possibility that innocent people have been imprisoned, or worse. And so, the system hesitated. Barboza, meanwhile, remained under protection. Relocated repeatedly, given new identities, he lived a life that bore little resemblance to the chaos he had left behind. He was monitored but not restrained, supported but not held accountable. He continued to talk. In interviews and private conversations, Barboza sometimes contradicted himself openly, boasting about crimes one day, denying them the next. He exaggerated his role in the underworld, inflating his reputation as both killer and informant. The line between truth and myth blurred further with each retelling. To some observers, it became clear that Barboza was no longer simply cooperating. He was shaping history, deciding which version of events would survive. Eventually, the tension reached a breaking point. Journalists began investigating the cases tied to Barboza's testimony. They interviewed former prosecutors, defense attorneys, and law enforcement officials willing to speak off the record. What emerged was a picture of a system that had placed expediency above caution. Articles raised uncomfortable questions. How many convictions rested primarily on Barboza's word? Why had corroborating evidence been so thin in certain cases? What safeguards, if any, had been in place to verify his claims? Public confidence wavered. For the first time, the idea that the government's star witness might also be its greatest liability entered mainstream discussion. The same man who helped dismantle the New England Mafia might also have helped destroy lives that did not deserve it. The irony was impossible to ignore. Barboza had been embraced because of his violence, not despite it. His willingness to kill made him valuable. His willingness to lie made him dangerous. And yet, the system had chosen to trust him with extraordinary power. As scrutiny intensified, federal agencies found themselves in an uncomfortable position. Defending Barboza meant defending every decision made in reliance on him. Acknowledging his dishonesty meant unraveling years of prosecutions. Neither option was appealing, so the response was measured, cautious, and slow. Internal reviews were launched quietly. Statements were crafted carefully. Responsibility was diffused across departments and time periods. No single decision, officials argued, could be blamed for the outcome. But for those already serving sentences based on Barboza's testimony, these explanations offered little comfort. The damage was done. What began as a groundbreaking use of an informant had become a cautionary tale. It revealed how easily justice can tilt when desperation meets opportunity. How a violent man, given the right incentives, can manipulate even the most powerful institutions. and it forced a question that would echo long after Barboza himself faded from view. If the truth can be shaped by those who benefit most from its distortion, who, then, is truly protected by the system? The answer was becoming harder to ignore. Chapter 3, Segment 1. The Informant becomes the system. By the time doubts about Joseph Barboza began to circulate more openly, the machinery surrounding him had grown too large to stop easily. He was no longer just a witness. He had become a pillar upon which entire prosecutions rested. Removing him would not simply weaken cases. It would collapse them in the years following his initial cooperation. Barboza's role expanded far beyond what anyone had originally envisioned. Prosecutors leaned on him not only to describe past crimes, but to interpret the inner workings of the Boston underworld itself. He explained motives. He identified hierarchies. He assigned guilt in ways that evidence alone could not in courtrooms. His voice carried authority. Jurors were told they were hearing from a man who knew the mob from the inside, someone who had survived because he chose to tell the truth. His violent past was presented as proof of credibility. He had done these things, they argued. He knew how it worked. What was rarely emphasized was how much Barboza stood to gain every time he spoke. His agreements with federal authorities were broad and flexible. Each new piece of information, each additional testimony, reinforced his value. The more damage he caused to others, the safer his own position became. Protection, relocation, financial assistance, and leniency were all tied to his usefulness. Truth became secondary to productivity. Inside FBI offices, Barboza's information was filtered, summarized, and repackaged into reports that traveled up the chain of command. Each retelling stripped away uncertainty and replaced it with confidence. By the time his claims reached court, they appeared solid, supported, and vetted. But much of that vetting was superficial. Agents were under pressure to deliver results. Organized crime had embarrassed law enforcement for decades, operating openly while convictions remained rare. Informants like Barboza offered a shortcut, a way-in, a promise of closure. As long as his information led to arrests, few were inclined to question the source too deeply. This dynamic created a dangerous feedback loop. Barboza learned what prosecutors wanted to hear. He learned which names mattered, which crimes carried weight, which narratives fit the government's theory of the case. Over time, his statements became more precise, more dramatic, and more damning. Not because he remembered more, but because he understood the system. He described murders with cinematic clarity. He placed himself close enough to events to appear credible, but far enough to avoid direct accountability. He implicated rivals, former associates, and men who could not easily defend themselves. Each story strengthened his standing. For federal agents, challenging him carried risk. Questioning Barboza too aggressively could jeopardize cases already in motion. Worse, it could expose the fragility of prior convictions. Doubt, once introduced, had a way of spreading so skepticism was often set aside that in private, some investigators acknowledged the discomfort. They spoke of managing Barboza rather than verifying him, of weighing his lies against his usefulness, of making peace with moral compromises in pursuit of a greater goal. Publicly, none of this was acknowledged. Barboza continued to testify, his reputation growing with each appearance. Media coverage framed him as a reformed monster, a man whose cooperation redeemed his past. The narrative was compelling. A killer turns on killers. Justice at last finds a way. But beneath that story was a quieter truth. Barboza was not being controlled. He was being enabled. The boundaries that normally constrained witnesses did not apply to him. He was shielded from scrutiny, insulated from consequences, and trusted with extraordinary influence. In effect, he had been deputized by the system meant to restrain him. And systems, once compromised, tend to protect themselves. As the years passed, the cost of this arrangement became increasingly difficult to ignore. Appeals multiplied. Journalists dug deeper. Defense teams uncovered contradictions that could no longer be dismissed as harmless errors. The question was no longer whether Barboza had lied, that IT was how much of the justice system had relied on those lies to function. What had begun as an alliance of convenience was turning into something else entirely. A relationship where the informant dictated outcomes and the authorities followed. The roles had reversed, and in that reversal, the line between law enforcement and organized crime grew dangerously thin. The reckoning was approaching, but first the truth would have to survive the very system built to suppress it. Chapter 3, Segment 2. Convictions built on a single voice. Long before the public began questioning Joseph Barboza's credibility, lives were already being altered permanently by his words. Courtrooms across Massachusetts and beyond echoed with his testimony, each appearance reinforcing the illusion that the government finally had organized crime under control. What juries did not see was how fragile these cases truly were. In trial after trial, Barboza's statements formed the backbone of the prosecution. Physical evidence was often limited or non-existent. Corroborating witnesses were rare. Timelines shifted subtly depending on the audience. Yet none of that seemed to matter because Barboza spoke with certainty. Certainty is persuasive, but he described meetings that no one else remembered, conversations that left no record, crimes that occurred in the shadows, where doubt could be brushed aside as ignorance. When defense attorneys pressed him, he responded calmly, confidently, as though recalling events etched permanently into memory. But memory was not what guided him. Barboza understood that prosecutors needed villains. They needed structure. They needed stories that could be told cleanly to juries unfamiliar with the chaos of the criminal underworld. So he gave them exactly that. Names were selected carefully. Some belonged to men already dead, unable to contradict him. Others were rivals whose removal served Barboza's interests. And in some cases, the targets were peripheral figures swept into narratives larger than their actual involvement. The system rewarded this behavior. Each successful conviction strengthened Barboza's value. Each guilty verdict validated the government's reliance on him. Judges cited his cooperation as exceptional. Prosecutors described him as indispensable. Agents defended him as flawed, but necessary, and one wanted to be responsible for pulling the thread. Meanwhile, the consequences unfolded quietly. Men were sentenced to life in prison. Families were shattered. Appeals were denied because Barboza's testimony had been deemed credible at trial. Courts deferred to prior rulings, trusting that the original process had been sound. IT was not in private. Defense attorneys began noticing patterns. Barboza's accounts shifted depending on who sat beside him at counsel table. Dates changed. Locations blurred. Details once described vividly faded or transformed under cross-examination. But inconsistency alone was not enough to overturn convictions. The burden rested on the accused to prove misconduct, to show intent, to demonstrate that Barboza's lies were not merely mistakes, but deliberate fabrications knowingly allowed by the government. That standard was nearly impossible to meet. Compounding the problem was the culture of secrecy surrounding informants. Files were sealed. Deals were obscured. Benefits granted to Barboza were downplayed or withheld entirely from defense teams. Juries never heard the full scope of what he received in exchange for his cooperation. Protection was layered upon protection. Federal agencies justified this secrecy as necessary for safety. Revealing too much, they argued, could endanger lives. But that justification also shielded misconduct from scrutiny. And misconduct was exactly what was happening. Barboza was not simply exaggerating his role. In multiple cases, independent evidence later contradicted his testimony entirely. Alibis ignored at trial resurfaced. Witnesses previously dismissed were suddenly credible. Physical evidence pointed elsewhere. Yet the convictions stood. Why? Because undoing them would require acknowledging a devastating truth: that the government's most celebrated weapon against the mob had been deeply compromised. That law enforcement, in its desperation for results, had empowered a man who manipulated justice for personal survival. This realization threatened more than individual cases. It threatened public trust. Admitting error would not only free wrongfully convicted men, it would expose systemic failure at the highest levels. It would raise questions about oversight, accountability, and the ethical boundaries of informant use the system resisted. Barboza continued living under protection, moving from city to city, insulated from the damage left behind. His past followed him only in fragments. To the public, he remained a shadowy figure, dangerous but controlled. The men imprisoned because of him. He was something else entirely. He was the reason birthdays passed behind bars, the reason children grew up without fathers, the reason appeals were written late at night, fueled by hope and exhaustion in equal measure. And slowly, the hope began to find support. Journalists took interest. Civil rights attorneys revisited old transcripts. Judges, removed enough from the original proceedings to see them clearly, began asking questions that should have been asked years earlier. Why was so much resting on one man's word? Why had contradictions been overlooked? Why had the government fought so hard to protect a witness with so much to lose? The answers, when they came, were unsettling. Barboza had not only lied, he had been allowed to lie. And in allowing it, the justice system had traded truth for expediency, fairness for conviction rates, and accountability for the illusion of control. The foundation was cracking. What remained was to see whether it would collapse quietly or bring everything down with it. Chapter 3, Segment 3, When Protection Becomes Permission. By the time doubts about Joseph Barboza's testimony began to surface in earnest, the damage was already deeply embedded in the justice system. His role was no longer limited to that of an informant. He had become a structural pillar. Remove him, and entire cases threatened to collapse. That reality created a dangerous dynamic. Instead of asking whether Barboza was telling the truth, the system began asking a different question entirely. What would happen if he wasn't? For prosecutors and federal agents who had built careers on dismantling the New England mob, admitting Barboza's unreliability meant admitting failure. Years of celebrated convictions would unravel. Headlines would shift from triumph to scandal. Trust, once broken, will be nearly impossible to restore as the protection continued. Barboza was moved frequently. New identities, new locations, new beginnings that existed only for him. Wherever he went, the government followed, ensuring his safety, monitoring his movements, and quietly managing the consequences of his presence. But protection slowly turned into permission that he understood as leverage. Barboza knew that as long as he remained useful, he was untouchable. His criminal history, however violent, became secondary to his value as a witness. Every murder he admitted to was reframed as cooperation. Every lie was softened as confusion. Every contradiction was excused as trauma that he learned how to operate within this space. When questioned by agents, he revealed just enough to maintain relevance. When testifying, he tailored his stories to match the prosecution's theory. When challenged, he relied on the authority granted to him by the state itself. After all, why would the government protect a liar? That assumption worked in his favor. Meanwhile, the ethical boundaries meant to govern Informant used blurred beyond recognition. Internal memos acknowledged Barboza's instability, his violence, and his manipulative tendencies. Yet those same documents emphasized his necessity, that he was described as dangerous but controlled, unreliable but essential. This contradiction sat at the heart of the scandal. Agents tasked with supervising Barboza faced an impossible balance. Push him too hard, and he might stop cooperating. Question him too deeply, and his stories might unravel. Let him go entirely, and the mob cases they depended on would collapse. They compromised. They overlooked discrepancies. They minimized complaints. They justified silence as strategy. In doing so, they crossed a line that would haunt federal law enforcement for decades. Barboza was no longer simply informing on crimes. He was shaping outcomes. Names he mentioned became suspects overnight. Stories he told determined investigative priorities. His word carried more weight than physical evidence, more influence than eyewitness accounts. That power corrupted everything it touched. Behind prison walls, men convicted on Barboza's testimony began comparing notes. Inconsistencies that once seemed isolated now formed patterns. Timelines conflicted. Descriptions didn't align. Events Barboza claimed to witness overlapped with his confirmed whereabouts elsewhere. Slowly, the narrative cracked. Defense attorneys filed motions. Civil rights groups demanded reviews. Journalists requested sealed records. And for the first time, the government was forced to confront the consequences of its choices. What they found was deeply troubling. Files reveal benefits far more extensive than juries have been told. Financial support, reduced sentences, protection from prosecution for crimes committed even after his cooperation began. In some instances, warnings about Barboza's lies have been raised internally and then dismissed. The truth was no longer deniable. The government had not merely failed to stop Barboza from lying, that IT had enabled him. This realization marked a turning point. Public trust eroded rapidly once the details emerged. Congressional inquiries followed. Courts reopened cases once thought settled forever. Convictions were overturned. Lives, once written off, were reevaluated. But justice came unevenly. Some men were freed after decades behind bars. Others died before their names could be cleared. Families who had waited years for answers received apologies instead of reparations. The system moved slowly, burdened by its own reluctance to admit fault. And Barboza, he watched it all from a distance. Living under protection did not bring peace. He remained paranoid, volatile, and isolated. The violence that once defined him never truly left. His reputation followed him in whispers. His safety depended entirely on the same system, now scrambling to contain the fallout of its decisions. In the end, Joseph Barboza did help bring down the New England Mafia. But the cost was far greater than anyone anticipated. He exposed not only organized crime, but the fragility of justice itself. He revealed how easily principles bend under pressure. How quickly safeguards erode when results are prioritized over truth, and how dangerous it becomes when the government decides that some lies are acceptable as long as they serve a larger goal. The reckoning was inevitable. What remained was the question of accountability. Who answers when the system itself becomes complicit? Chapter 4, Segment 1. The unraveling begins. Long before courts reopened cases or journalists uncovered sealed files, the first cracks in Joseph Barboza's credibility appeared quietly, almost invisibly, in places few people were looking. They appeared in transcripts. They appeared in margins of police reports. They appeared in conversations between defense attorneys who began noticing that the same witness seemed to remember events differently depending on who was asking the questions. IT first. These inconsistencies were dismissed as human. Error. Barboza had lived a violent life. Trauma, prosecutors argue, affected memory. Dates could blur. Faces could merge. Small details could be mistaken without undermining the larger truth. But the inconsistencies did not remain small. They multiplied in one case. Barboza claimed to have witnessed a murder on a night when records showed he was hundreds of miles away. In another, he described conversations with men who were already incarcerated at the time he said the meeting occurred. In yet another, his account of a killing shifted subtly across trials, changing locations, weapons, and participants while retaining the same conclusion. Always the same outcome. Always the same names. Defense lawyers began compiling side-by-side comparisons. What emerged was unsettling. Barboza's testimony was not merely flawed. It appeared adaptive. His stories bent to fit the needs of each case, adjusting details while preserving the accusation. This pattern raised a question that had once been unthinkable. Was Barboza recalling crimes or constructing them? As this question gained momentum, the system responded cautiously. Prosecutors resisted reopening settled convictions. Courts were reluctant to challenge verdicts reached years earlier. Admitting error carried enormous consequences, both legal and political, but the pressure grew. Civil rights advocates took notice. Law professors examined the transcripts. Investigative reporters began filing Freedom of Information requests, pushing back against decades of secrecy surrounding informant agreements. What they found contradicted what juries had been told, that Barboza's cooperation deals were far broader than disclosed in court. He had received extensive financial support. He had been shielded from prosecution for crimes committed after he became an informant. In some instances, agents intervened directly to prevent local authorities from pursuing charges against him. These were not minor omissions. They were material facts. Under the law, juries are entitled to know what a witness receives in exchange for testimony. They are entitled to assess credibility with full transparency. In Barboza's cases, that transparency had been deliberately withheld. The justification was always the same: national security, ongoing investigations, witness safety. But behind those explanations lay a simpler truth. Barboza was too valuable to lose that as scrutiny intensified. Former FBI agents began speaking off the record. Some admitted discomfort with how far the protection had gone. Others defended their actions, arguing that the Mafia posed a greater threat than any one informant's dishonesty. The logic was stark that if lies dismantled a criminal empire, were they truly unacceptable? This reasoning reflected a deeper institutional mindset. Law enforcement, especially at the federal level, was measured by outcomes. Convictions mattered. Statistics mattered. Public victories mattered. The methods used to achieve those outcomes often faded into the background. In this environment, Barboza thrived that he was not just a witness. He was a solution. Each time investigators hit a dead end, Barboza offered a path forward. Each time a case stalled, he provided names. Each time evidence fell short, his testimony filled the gap. That convenience came at a cost. Men were convicted based largely on his word. Physical evidence was minimal or non-existent. Corroboration was thin. But the authority of the federal government lent Barboza's statements a credibility that overwhelmed skepticism. Jurors trusted the system. They assumed safeguards existed. They believed no government agency would stake its reputation on a liar. This assumption would later prove devastating. As appeals slowly made their way through the courts, judges began ordering evidentiary hearings. Former prosecutors were called to testify. Agents were questioned under oath. Internal memos, once buried in archives, were read aloud in open court. The story that emerged was not one of isolated misconduct, that IT was systemic. Oversight mechanisms had failed repeatedly. Informant guidelines were ignored. Supervisory warnings were downplayed. Ethical boundaries were crossed in service of expediency. And at the center of it all stood Joseph Barboza, not as a mastermind controlling the system, but as a man whose violence and instability were knowingly tolerated because he delivered results. This distinction mattered. Barboza exploited the system, yes, but the system also exploited him. It used his capacity for brutality, his willingness to fabricate, and his hunger for survival to achieve goals that would have otherwise been unreachable. But in doing so, it surrendered moral authority. The unraveling was slow, painful, and incomplete. Some convictions were overturned. Others stood, protected by procedural barriers and statutes of limitation. Accountability was uneven, scattered across agencies and individuals long retired or deceased. What could not be undone was the damage to trust. Communities already wary of law enforcement saw their fears confirmed. Innocent families learned that justice had been negotiated behind closed doors. Victims questioned whether truth had ever mattered at all. And Joseph Barboza, once the government's most valuable witness, became its most dangerous liability. The reckoning had begun. What followed would force the nation to confront an uncomfortable reality, that the line between justice and injustice is not always crossed in moments of chaos, but often in quiet decisions made behind locked doors. Chapter 4, Segment 2, The Cost of a Convenient Witness. As the legal challenges surrounding Joseph Barboza deepened, another truth slowly surfaced, one that went beyond false testimony or procedural misconduct. The damage caused by Barboza's cooperation was not limited to courtrooms. It rippled outward, touching families, communities, and an entire justice system struggling to reconcile outcomes with integrity. For the men Barboza accused, prison was not an abstract consequence. It was years lost to concrete walls, locked doors, and the slow erosion of identity. Some entered incarceration as young men and emerged decades later as strangers to the world they once knew. Others never emerged at all. Their families lived in suspension. Children grew up believing their fathers were monsters. Parents died without seeing their sons cleared. Wives exhausted savings on legal fees, chasing appeals that moved at a glacial pace. Every holiday, every birthday, every quiet dinner carried the weight of absence, and all of it rested, in large part, on the testimony of a man whose credibility had been knowingly compromised. Court records revealed moments where prosecutors privately acknowledged doubts about Barboza's reliability while publicly presenting him as trustworthy. In internal correspondence, agents expressed concern about his mental stability, his substance abuse, and his tendency toward exaggeration. Yet none of that reached juries. Instead, Barboza was framed as a reluctant insider, haunted by his past, seeking redemption through cooperation. His violent reputation was softened. His incentives were minimized. His history of manipulation was omitted. The narrative was curated. This curation reflected a deeper institutional failure, the belief that juries needed protection from complexity, that too much information would confuse them, that the greater good required simplification. But simplification became distortion. As appellate courts reviewed the cases, judges confronted a difficult dilemma. The legal system values finality. Overturning convictions threatens stability. It opens floodgates. It raises uncomfortable questions about countless other cases resolved under similar conditions. Some courts chose restraint. They acknowledged misconduct, but ruled it insufficient to overturn verdicts. They cited overwhelming evidence, even when that evidence was thin. They leaned on procedural technicalities rather than substantive truth. Others took a harder line that, in rare instances, convictions were vacated. New trials were ordered. Prosecutors were forced to concede that Barboza's testimony had been unreliable. These moments were seismic but isolated. There was no sweeping reckoning in broad apology, in comprehensive review of cases tied to Barboza's cooperation. Part of the reason lay in the passage of time. Evidence had degraded. Witnesses had died. Records were incomplete. Reconstructing the past became nearly impossible. Another reason was institutional self-preservation. Acknowledging systemic failure invites accountability. It exposes agencies to lawsuits, damages reputations, and undermines public confidence. For organizations built on authority, that risk can feel existential. Responsibility diffused, blame shifted. Individual agents retired quietly. Supervisors cited pressures of the era. Policies were rewritten without explicit admission of wrongdoing. Lessons were promised, if not always learned. Meanwhile, Barboza himself receded into the background at IN witness protection. He lived under assumed names, moving between locations, always under supervision, yet never truly controlled. His behavior remained erratic. He clashed with handlers. He violated conditions. He continued to fabricate stories, even when there was no clear benefit. Those who worked with him describe a man consumed by paranoia and anger. He saw enemies everywhere. He believed betrayal was inevitable. Violence, once a means of power, became a reflex. The government that had once shielded him now struggled to manage him. This shift marked a turning point. Barboza was no longer useful. The Mafia had been weakened. Major prosecutions were complete. His value as a witness declined as scrutiny increased. Protecting him no longer justified the cost. And when protection erodes, consequences follow. For years, Barboza had lived above the law, insulated by agreements and handlers. Without that insulation, he became what he had always been, a deeply unstable man with a long list of enemies. Some were criminals. Others were people he had wronged through lies. Others still were former allies who saw him as a liability. The irony was stark. The same system that had empowered Barboza to destroy lives now stepped back, allowing him to drift toward a fate he had narrowly avoided for decades. In the end, the cost of a convenient witness could be measured in more than overturned convictions or tarnished reputations. Could be measured in broken trust. Trust between citizens and courts, between communities and law enforcement, between truth and justice. Once fractured, that trust proved far harder to repair than any individual case. And as the final chapters of Joseph Barboza's life approached, it became clear that the damage he left behind would outlast him, lingering in legal precedents, institutional memory, and the quiet understanding that sometimes the most dangerous criminals are not those who break the law, but those who are allowed to bend it. Chapter 4, Segment 3, The Informant Who Could Not Be Contained. By the time Joseph Barboza entered the witness protection program, the idea itself was still experimental. There was no clear blueprint for how to manage a cooperating mob killer whose criminal history dwarfed that of nearly any informant before him. Barboza was not simply a source. He was a volatile force, and the system built to contain him was unprepared for what that truly meant on paper. Witness protection promised anonymity, structure, and control. In practice, Barboza resisted all three. He was relocated repeatedly, given new identities, new addresses, new handlers. Each move was intended to keep him safe. Each one only amplified his paranoia. He mistrusted everyone. He believed surveillance followed him constantly. He accused handlers of conspiring against him. He cycled between cooperation and hostility, gratitude and rage. Those assigned to monitor him described a man incapable of stability. Barboza struggled with substance abuse, emotional volatility, and an unrelenting need for dominance. The habits that had sustained him in the criminal underworld did not disappear when he crossed into federal protection. They intensified that he argued with neighbors. He threatened strangers. He violated program rules with alarming frequency. He carried weapons. He boasted about his past. He spoke openly about violence, as if reliving it gave him comfort. The government attempted discipline. Restrictions were imposed. Warnings were issued. At times, he was temporarily removed from protection facilities. But the fundamental problem remained unchanged. Barboza could not be reshaped. Unlike informants who sought safety or redemption, Barboza sought control. Cooperation had been a means to survive, not to change. And once survival was assured, his incentive to comply diminished. Internally, federal agencies began to reassess their relationship with him. The calculus shifted. Early on, Barboza had been indispensable. His testimony dismantled the New England Mafia's leadership structure. His words carried prosecutions forward. His value justified extraordinary tolerance. But as years passed, that value declined. Cases concluded. Appeals settled. New evidence standards emerged. And Barboza's credibility, once carefully insulated, became increasingly questioned. Defense attorneys began referencing inconsistencies. Judges expressed skepticism. Media investigations resurfaced doubts long buried. The protection he received started to feel less like an obligation and more like a liability. Barboza sensed this shift. He complained of abandonment. He accused the government of betrayal. He demanded compensation, privileges, recognition. He reminded handlers of what he had done for them. The lives destroyed, the enemies eliminated, the risks taken. But leverage had a shelf life. By the mid-1970s, Barboza was no longer the government's prized asset. He was a problem to be managed, minimized, eventually distanced. This transition was subtle but decisive. Oversight loosened, resources thinned, attention drifted, and in that vacuum, danger returned that Barboza's criminal past ensured he would never be free from threat. Word of his whereabouts circulated quietly. Former associates spoke his name with bitterness. Families of men imprisoned on his testimony harbored unresolved rage. In the underworld, time does not erase debts. It merely delays collection. Barboza attempted to reassert relevance by offering new information, new accusations, new stories. Some were credible, many were not. Investigators listened politely, but the urgency was gone that he was no longer steering outcomes. He was reacting to them. In 1976, while living under an assumed identity in San Francisco, Joseph Barboza was shot and killed. The circumstances were violent but unceremonious. There was no dramatic standoff, no public reckoning, just a man found dead, far from Boston, far from the streets that had once defined him. The killer was never definitively identified. Some suspected organized crime retaliation. Others believed it was personal, a settling of scores unrelated to Mafia hierarchy. Perhaps someone connected to the false testimony. Perhaps someone who recognized him despite the alias. The truth remains unresolved. What is clear is that Barboza died as he lived, surrounded by secrecy, mistrust, and violence. There was no redemption, ARC, no final confession, no public apology to the men whose lives he had helped destroy. His death closed one chapter, but left many others unfinished in the years that followed. Historians and legal scholars examined Barboza's legacy with growing unease. His cooperation had undeniably weakened organized crime in New England. At the same time, it had exposed profound vulnerabilities in the justice system. He was proof that ends-driven enforcement could corrode ethical boundaries. That truth, when filtered through desperation and ambition, could become malleable, that the line between criminal and protector could blur beyond recognition. Joseph the Animal. Barboza was both weapon and warning, that a man so violent that even mobsters feared him, so manipulative that federal institutions empowered him, so unstable that no system could ultimately contain him. And when he was gone, the damage he left behind did not vanish with him, but it lingered in overturned convictions, in unresolved doubts, and the quiet realization that sometimes the most dangerous figure in a criminal story is not the killer, but the witness everyone chose to believe. Chapter 5, Segment 1, The Collapse of Trust. Long after Joseph Barboza was gone, the consequences of his cooperation continued to unfold in ways few could have predicted at the time. His death did not close the book on his story. Instead, it opened a deeper examination of a system that had elevated him, protected him, and relied upon him without fully reckoning with who he was in the years following his murder. Journalists, defense attorneys, and historians began revisiting the cases built on Barboza's testimony. What they found was not a single failure, but a pattern, one that revealed how fragile justice can become when institutions prioritize outcomes over process. And the center of this reckoning was a growing realization that Barboza had not simply cooperated with the FBI. He had shaped investigations. He had influenced prosecutorial strategy. And in some instances, he had effectively decided who would be targeted and who would be spared. This was not how the system was supposed to work. Informants were meant to supplement evidence, not replace it. Their testimony was supposed to be tested, corroborated, challenged. But in Barboza's case, his value had created deference. His stories were rarely interrogated with the skepticism they deserved. His motives were acknowledged privately, but downplayed publicly. Over time, this imbalance became impossible to ignore. Appeals filed by convicted men began to reference newly uncovered inconsistencies. Defense teams pointed to contradictions between Barboza's statements and physical evidence. In some cases, timelines simply did not align. In others, alleged accomplices had alibis that were never fully examined. The problem was not that Barboza had lied once at IT, was that his lies had been absorbed into the official record. Prosecutors who had relied on his testimony defended their actions by citing the standards of the era. Organized crime was opaque. Witnesses were scarce. Cooperation was rare. They argued that without Barboza, entire criminal networks would have remained untouched. This justification carried weight, but it did not erase the cost. Judges reviewing these cases faced an uncomfortable dilemma. To overturn convictions meant acknowledging that the justice system had failed not incidentally, but structurally. It meant admitting that truth had been subordinated to expedience. Some courts chose caution. They ruled that even if Barboza had been unreliable, there was sufficient additional evidence to uphold verdicts. Others focused on procedural rules, stating that challenges came too late or failed to meet technical thresholds. Yet beneath these rulings, doubt persisted. Legal scholars began using Barboza's case as a cautionary example. Law schools dissected it. Ethics committees referenced it. Training materials quietly evolved to emphasize corroboration and disclosure obligations. But reforms arrived slowly. For the public, the story was more visceral. Media coverage reframed Barboza not just as a violent criminal, but as a symbol of institutional compromise. Headlines questioned how a man responsible for dozens of murders could be treated as a hero. Documentaries highlighted the lives ruined by his testimony. Families spoke openly about the pain of knowing their loved ones had been sacrificed for prosecutorial success. Trust eroded. Communities that had already felt alienated from law enforcement now saw confirmation of their worst fears. That justice was negotiable, that power insulated itself, that truth could be bent when convenient. This erosion extended beyond Boston. Federal agencies nationwide began re-evaluating informant programs. Internal reviews examined how incentives distorted behavior. Guidelines were updated to require greater disclosure benefits offered to cooperating witnesses. Oversight mechanisms were strengthened, at least on paper. Still, the shadow of Barboza lingered. His story raised questions with no easy answers. Can a system built on adversarial truth ever safely rely on habitual liars? How much violence is tolerable in the pursuit of justice? And at what point does cooperation become complicity? Barboza himself offered no clarity. He left behind no memoir, no reflective interviews, no expressions of regret. His voice survives only in transcripts, cold, clinical records of testimony that once carried immense weight. What remains instead is an absence of certainty, in absence of closure for those harmed, and an absence of confidence that such a failure could not happen again. As Chapter 5 unfolds, the focus shifts from the man to the legacy he left behind. A legacy defined not only by bloodshed and betrayal, but by a fundamental question that still echoes through courtrooms and agencies. Today, what happens when the justice system builds its foundations on a witness who was never bound by the truth? Chapter 5, Segment 2, Lives Left in the Ruins. For the men convicted on Joseph Barboza's testimony, justice did not arrive with headlines or apologies. It arrived slowly, unevenly, and for many, not at all. Years passed before the full scope of Barboza's unreliability entered public discussion. By then, the consequences were deeply embedded in real lives. Prison sentences had already been served, careers erased, families fractured beyond repair. Even when doubts surfaced, they rarely translated into freedom. Inside prison walls, time moved differently. Men labeled as mob killers lived under constant threat, isolated by reputation as much as by steel doors. Some maintained their innocence quietly, knowing that protest only hardened skepticism. Others grew bitter, watching appeals stall while the man who condemned them lived freely under government protection. For their families, the damage was generational. Children grew up visiting prisons instead of playgrounds. Letters replaced conversations. Phone calls replaced presence. The stigma followed them into schools, jobs, neighborhoods. Even when doubts about Barboza emerged, suspicion did not disappear. The verdicts remained official. The records unchanged. Truth, once lost, proved difficult to reclaim. When journalists began interviewing families affected by Barboza's testimony, a common theme emerged. Not rage, but exhaustion. Decades of waiting had drained anger into something quieter. A resignation that justice, if it came at all, would come too late to matter. Some families pursued civil suits. These cases faced steep obstacles. Sovereign immunity shielded federal agencies. Prosecutorial discretion limited liability. Courts acknowledged harm while denying remedy. The system that had failed them now protected itself. Others sought public acknowledgement rather than legal relief. They testified before commissions, spoke to reporters, shared documents. Their goal was simple: to ensure that what happened to them would not be repeated, that the names of the innocent would not be erased beneath the reputation of a violent informant. Slowly, reforms followed. Disclosure rules tightened. Informant agreements required greater transparency. Courts demanded corroboration where once testimony alone sufficed. But reforms offered little solace to those already buried beneath wrongful convictions. The past could not be rewritten. Meanwhile, inside law enforcement, Barboza's case became a cautionary reference spoken quietly, often without naming him directly. Training emphasized distance, skepticism, documentation, Yet the temptation to rely on insiders never vanished. Because informants solve cases, they always have, and they always will. The uncomfortable truth is that Barboza did not exploit a broken system. He exploited a functioning one, a system designed to trade certainty for results, speed for precision, closure for complexity. He simply pushed it to its breaking point. For some agents involved, guilt lingered. Retired officials spoke anonymously of regret, of decisions made under pressure, of warnings ignored, of moments where doubts surfaced but were set aside for the sake of progress. Others remained defensive. They argued that organized crime required extraordinary measures, that Barboza's information dismantled violent networks, that without him, countless murders would have gone unpunished. They framed the collateral damage as tragic but unavoidable. Between these perspectives lay an unresolved moral fault line. Is justice measured by outcomes or by methods? Does removing criminals excuse empowering monsters? And who bears responsibility when the system chooses expedience over certainty? For the men who lost decades of their lives, these questions were not academic. They were daily realities, replayed in memories of missed funerals, lost time, and the hollow silence of lives paused by lies. Joseph Barboza never faced them, he never apologized, he never acknowledged the weight of what he had done beyond his own survival, in death. He escaped accountability just as he had in life, leaving others to carry the consequences of his cooperation, as Chapter 5 continues. The focus turns to how Barboza's story reshaped public understanding of informants, corruption, and the thin line separating justice from injustice. Because while Joseph Barboza was a singular figure, the conditions that enabled him were not. And that reality remains far more unsettling than any single crime. Chapter 5, Segment 3, A Legacy Written in Silence. As the years passed, Joseph Barboza's name slowly faded from headlines, but the quiet damage he left behind never truly disappeared. His story did not end with his death, nor did it conclude with court rulings or internal reforms. Instead, it settled into something far more enduring, a lingering silence shaped by discomfort, uncertainty, and unresolved responsibility. For institutions, silence was convenient. The FBI never issued a formal reckoning for the role it played in empowering Barboza. There was no public apology to the men wrongfully convicted, no official admission that safeguards failed, no transparent accounting of how many cases were compromised by his testimony. Instead, the narrative shifted subtly over time. Barboza was reframed as a product of a different era, an anomaly, an unfortunate necessity in a violent chapter of American history. This framing allowed distance, why isolating blame to the past. Agencies avoided confronting the present. The lesson became abstract rather than actionable. Barboza was cited as an example of what could go wrong, not what did go wrong. A crucial distinction that softened accountability. Within the legal system, his name appeared less frequently, but his influence lingered. Precedents shaped by his cooperation remained intact. Convictions upheld on technical grounds stayed in place. Appeals denied years earlier were never revisited. The machinery of justice continued forward, carrying unresolved errors like hidden fractures beneath the surface. For victims' families, the silence was heavier. They watched as documentaries, books, and articles debated Barboza's role in history, often focusing on his brutality or his significance in dismantling the New England Mafia. Their suffering was acknowledged briefly, then set aside in favor of broader themes: corruption, strategy, power. Individual lives became footnotes. Some families stopped speaking publicly altogether. The emotional toll of retelling their stories outweighed the slim chance of change. Others continued quietly, filing motions, writing letters, preserving documents, hoping that one day the right combination of attention and timing might reopen doors long closed. Time, however, was not kind. Witnesses died. Memories faded. Evidence degraded. Each passing year made the truth harder to reconstruct. In this way, the system's delay became its own form of resolution. Not justice, but exhaustion. Barboza himself remained a paradox. He was undeniably violent. His crimes were real. His victims were real. Yet his role as an informant complicated how history judged him. He was neither purely villain nor reluctant hero. He occupied a space that resisted simple categorization, a space where brutality intersected with utility and truth blurred into strategy. This ambiguity proved unsettling. Society prefers clear moral boundaries. Barboza challenged them. He forced uncomfortable questions into the open about who is allowed to speak for justice, what price is acceptable for results, and how far institutions will bend when power is at stake in academic circles. His case continued to surface in discussions of criminal ethics and informant reliability. Scholars debated whether his cooperation ultimately saved lives by weakening organized crime or cost lives by corrupting the justice process. There was no consensus. Perhaps there never could be. What remained consistent was the recognition that Barboza's story was not just about one man. It was about the system that enabled him, protected him, and believed him, even when belief was dangerous. That in quiet moments, former agents reflected on the past with unease. Some questioned decisions they once defended. Others maintained their positions but acknowledged privately that things would be handled differently today. Yet today offered little comfort to those already harmed. The men imprisoned because of Barboza's lies aged behind bars or rebuilt lives after release, carrying the weight of stigma that never fully lifted. Their names were never as widely known as Barboza's. Their stories never reached the same audience. History remembered the informant more vividly than the innocent. This imbalance became part of Barboza's final legacy. Not just a trail of violence, not just a corruption scandal, but a reminder that when institutions prioritize control over truth, silence becomes the most enduring outcome. Silence for the wrongfully convicted, silence from those in power, silence that allows the same structures to persist, slightly revised, but fundamentally unchanged at AS. The documentary moves forward, the focus shifts toward a broader reckoning. Not with Joseph Barboza alone, but with the system that made him possible. Because while the animal is gone, the conditions that elevated him remain. And that truth, more than any single crime, continues to echo quietly through the history of American justice. Chapter 6, Segment 1, The Man Behind the Myth. To understand how Joseph, the animal Barboza, was able to manipulate both the Mafia and the federal government, it is necessary to step back from the courtroom transcripts and informant files and look closely at the man himself. Not as a legend, but as a human being shaped by violence long before he became useful to anyone in power. Barboza's reputation did not emerge overnight. It was built slowly, reinforced by years of unchecked aggression and a complete absence of restraint. From an early age, those around him noticed something unsettling. Anger came easily to him, and empathy did not. Where others hesitated, Barboza advanced. Where others calculated risk, he acted on impulse. Violence was not a tool he picked up later in life. It was a language he learned early and spoke fluently. In Boston's criminal ecosystem, this made him both valuable and dangerous. Organized crime relies on predictability, loyalty, discipline, hierarchy. Barboza respected none of these in a meaningful way. He followed orders when it benefited him and ignored them when it did not. Fear, rather than allegiance, was how he maintained position. This unpredictability is what earned him his nickname. Other mobsters killed when necessary. Barboza killed when offended, when bored, when intoxicated, when he felt slighted. He did not need authorization to escalate a situation into bloodshed. That made him effective as an enforcer, but terrifying as an associate. People who worked alongside him later described a man who seemed detached from consequences. He did not dwell on guilt. He did not reflect on aftermath. Violence ended conversations for him. It simplified the world into silence. This psychological profile was precisely what made him unsuitable as a witness, and precisely what made him attractive to law enforcement desperate for access. The FBI did not create Barboza's brutality. They inherited it, but they underestimated it. Psychologists who later reviewed his behavior patterns noted classic traits of antisocial personality disorder: impulsivity, deceitfulness, aggression, lack of remorse. These traits do not disappear under supervision. They adapt. Barboza adapted quickly. When he realized that his stories were rewarded with protection, his instinct was not to tell the truth. It was to optimize outcomes. He learned which details impressed agents, which names carried weight, which narratives aligned with prosecutorial goals. In essence, he became what the system incentivized. This adaptation was not subtle. It was constant. When pressed for clarity, he filled gaps confidently. When confronted with contradictions, he reframed. When challenged, he escalated emotionally, portraying himself as persecuted or endangered. And because he had real knowledge mixed with fabrication, separating fact from fiction became increasingly difficult. This is where myth overtook reality. Barboza's legend grew, not only on the streets, but inside federal offices. He was spoken of as uniquely courageous for turning against the Mafia, as indispensable, as a necessary evil. Over time, this narrative insulated him from scrutiny. Once someone becomes central to success, questioning them feels like sabotage. This dynamic is not unique to Barboza. It appears repeatedly in cases where informants are elevated beyond accountability. But Barboza represents its most extreme expression. He was not merely tolerated, he was protected. And protection bred entitlement. Barboza began to behave as though the rules no longer applied to him. He violated witness protection conditions with confidence that consequences would be minimal. He spoke recklessly about his past. He threatened people he believed disrespected him. He continued to live as though violence were still his primary currency. Handlers documented concerns. Memos were written. Meetings were held. Yet action lagged. Because confronting Barboza meant confronting the uncomfortable truth that the system had placed too much faith in a man incapable of honesty or restraint at IT was easier to manage him than to admit failure. This reluctance allowed Barboza to operate in a gray space, neither fully criminal nor fully protected, neither accountable nor contained. He existed between institutions, exploiting gaps with the same instincts that once made him feared on the streets. As Chapter 6 unfolds, the focus turns inward, away from courtrooms and headlines, and toward the psychological and institutional blind spots that allowed Joseph Barboza to become something far more dangerous than a hitman. He became a mirror point one that reflected not just criminal violence, but the vulnerabilities of the system that believed it could control him, and what that mirror revealed would have consequences long after his voice disappeared from the record. Chapter 6, Segment 2, When Institutions Lose Their Grip. As scrutiny around Joseph Barboza intensified, the problem was no longer simply about one violent informant. It was about how institutions respond when control begins to slip, and how difficult it becomes to course correct once authority has been compromised. Inside federal agencies, Barboza's behavior increasingly triggered internal concern. Reports described him as volatile, confrontational, and unpredictable. Handlers documented violations of witness protection rules. He missed scheduled check-ins. He traveled without authorization. He associated with people he was explicitly instructed to avoid. Each infraction chipped away at the illusion that he could be managed. Yet responses remained cautious. The reason was structural. Barboza's testimony had already been woven into major prosecutions. Court victories had been secured. Careers had advanced. Admitting that their most valuable witness was spiraling out of control risked unraveling not just cases, but reputations that end bureaucratic systems. Momentum is powerful. Once a narrative takes hold, that an informant is essential, that outcomes justify compromises. Reversing course requires a level of institutional humility that is rare under pressure. It is far easier to reframe problems as temporary, manageable, or exaggerated than to confront foundational errors as concerns or compartmentalized one department flagged risks. Another minimized them. Supervisors debated severity while deferring decisive action. The machinery continued to move forward, even as confidence eroded behind closed doors. Barboza sensed this hesitation. He had spent his life reading power dynamics. He recognized uncertainty when he saw it. And like any experienced predator, he exploited it. His interactions with handlers became transactional. He reminded them of what he had delivered. He implied future cooperation or withdrawal, depending on how he was treated. This leverage worked because the system allowed it to in effect. Barboza inverted the relationship. Rather than being managed by the government, he influenced it. Decisions about his protection, his benefits, and his oversight increasingly reflected negotiation rather than enforcement. This inversion carried consequences as time passed. The government's willingness to discipline Barboza diminished. Enforcement of program rules became inconsistent. Sanctions were delayed or softened. Each exception reinforced his belief that he remained untouchable, and untouchability is corrosive that IT erodes restraint. It amplifies risk-taking. It convinces individuals that boundaries are optional. For Barboza, whose worldview was already shaped by dominance and intimidation, this environment validated his worst instincts. The tension between necessity and accountability reached a breaking point as defense attorneys began uncovering internal records. Memos surfaced that revealed doubts about Barboza's credibility. Reports hinted at manipulation. Testimony that once appeared airtight now showed fractures. The government's response was defensive. Prosecutors argued that informants are inherently flawed, that perfect witnesses do not exist in organized crime cases, that Barboza's violence did not negate the truth of his information. These arguments were not entirely without merit, but they sidestepped a deeper issue. The issue was not imperfection, that IT was imbalance. Barboza had been granted extraordinary latitude without proportional oversight. His word had been elevated beyond its reliability. His incentives had been allowed to distort outcomes. As this reality became harder to ignore, the government faced a choice: tighten control and risk exposure, or distance itself and hope the problem resolved quietly. IT chose distance. Gradually, resources allocated to Barboza diminished. Attention shifted elsewhere. He remained under protection, but the intensity faded. Oversight became more procedural than proactive. Communication slowed. This withdrawal was subtle but consequential. Barboza interpreted it as abandonment. His paranoia deepened. He believed enemies were closing in. He accused former handlers of betrayal. His behavior grew more erratic, more reckless. In this phase, the system's earlier failure to establish firm boundaries returned with force. Barboza was no longer a controlled asset. He was an unpredictable liability drifting beyond institutional reach. And when institutions lose their grip, the outcomes are rarely orderly. What followed was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual unraveling, a sequence of misjudgments, hesitations, and deferred decisions that allowed danger to accumulate unchecked. That be why the time the consequences became unavoidable. Intervention was no longer possible. As Chapter 6 continues, the focus turns to the final stage of this unraveling, how a man once, protected at the highest levels, was left exposed, and how the same instincts that once made him valuable ultimately sealed his fate. Because when power withdraws without accountability, it does not resolve conflict, it merely postpones it, often until the cost is irreversible. Chapter 6, Segment 3, The Unraveling. By the mid-1970s, Joseph Barboza existed in a state that could no longer be described as protection, control, or cooperation. What remained was a fragile illusion of safety held together by outdated agreements and fading institutional interest. The machinery that once shielded him had slowed, and the world he had betrayed had never forgotten him. Barboza felt it before anyone said it out loud. The calls from handlers became infrequent. Meetings were shorter, more formal. The tone had changed. Where there had once been urgency, there was now distance. Where there had once been accommodation, there was now caution. The government was no longer investing in his future. It was simply waiting for the past to stay buried. For someone like Barboza, this shift was unbearable, but he had survived by forcing reactions from people. Fear, deference, attention. Indifference was something he did not know how to navigate. Without constant reinforcement of his importance, his paranoia intensified. Every unfamiliar face felt threatening. Every delay felt intentional. Every silence felt like a setup. He began carrying weapons again. He spoke openly about being hunted. Sometimes he named enemies. Sometimes he accused ghosts. His stories grew more fragmented, more incoherent, cycling between rage and despair. To those around him, he appeared unstable. To himself, he felt cornered. This was the consequence of a life built on violence. Barboza had never learned how to exist without enemies. When the Mafia was dismantled, when the FBI withdrew, when the spotlight dimmed, he was left alone with instincts that had no outlet except destruction. He could not return a crime without exposure. He could not rely on protection without relevance. He could not trust anyone long enough to feel safe. Isolation became absolute. Those responsible for monitoring him noted escalating concerns. Reports described emotional volatility, threats, erratic movements. But intervention came too late. There was no longer a clear mandate to act decisively. Responsibility had dispersed across agencies. Ownership had blurred. This diffusion of responsibility was fatal. In 1976, Joseph Barboza was living under an assumed identity in San Francisco. Far from Boston, far from federal courtrooms, far from the streets that had shaped him. Yet distance offered no absolution. His reputation traveled quietly. His past followed him like a shadow. When he was killed, the act was swift and final. There was no confrontation captured on record, no public spectacle, no official explanation that satisfied lingering questions. Just a man found dead. His life ended not by the system that protected him, but by the violence he had spent decades cultivating. The investigation into his death produced theories, not conclusions. Some believed it was organized crime retaliation, delayed but deliberate. Others suspected personal vengeance, unrelated to Mafia hierarchy. A few considered the possibility of coincidence, the random collision of a violent man with another violent circumstance. The truth remains unresolved. What is known is that Barboza died without facing the full consequences of his actions. He never stood trial for the murders he confessed to. He never answered directly to the men whose lives he helped destroy through false testimony. He never reconciled with the damage he caused. His death closed the story abruptly, without reflection or reckoning. For the institutions involved, it was a quiet relief. There was no longer a volatile informant to manage. No unpredictable liability. No living reminder of ethical compromise. Barboza's file could be closed. His name archived. His case reframed as history rather than responsibility. But closure is not the same as resolution. The men wrongfully convicted because of his words remained incarcerated or permanently scarred. Families carried unanswered questions. Trust in the justice system, once fractured, did not automatically repair itself. That Barboza's end did not erase the past. That IT simply froze IT in retrospect. His fate seemed inevitable. A man who lived by violence rarely escapes it. Yet inevitability does not absolve failure. His death marked the final consequence of a series of decisions. Not only his own, but those made by powerful institutions that believed they could harness brutality without being consumed by it. They were wrong. As Chapter 6 closes, one truth becomes unavoidable. Joseph Barboza was not just a criminal who exploited the system. He was a product of what the system allowed, excused, and ultimately abandoned. His life demonstrated how easily lines blur when fear and ambition outweigh restraint. And his death underscored a lesson written repeatedly throughout criminal history. When violence is tolerated for convenience, it does not remain contained at IT waits, and eventually, it collects its debt. Chapter 7, Segment 1, The Informant Who Changed the Rules. When Joseph the Animal Barboza entered witness protection, he did more than betray the New England Mafia. He permanently altered how American law enforcement would view informants, for better and for worse. His cooperation marked a turning point, not because it was ethical, but because it was effective. And effectiveness, in the eyes of institutions under pressure, has a way of redefining acceptable behavior. Before Barboza, the idea of protecting a mass murderer in exchange for testimony was untested at this scale. Informants existed, but they were typically low-level figures, bookies, drivers, minor associates. Barboza was different. He was a killer, a central actor, a man whose hands were stained with blood so fresh that some of his crimes were still unsolved. Yet he was rewarded. This reward sent a message that rippled quietly through the criminal underworld and the justice system alike. It told mobsters that cooperation could outweigh loyalty. It told prosecutors that morality could be negotiated. And it told institutions that rules could bend if the prize was large enough. The precedent mattered. In the years following Barboza's cooperation, informant usage expanded rapidly. Federal agencies leaned more heavily on insiders. Deals grew more complex. Protections became more generous. And oversight, while discussed, often lagged behind practice. Barboza became the unspoken blueprint. His case was cited internally as proof that extreme measures could dismantle entrenched criminal organizations. That fear-based silence could be broken if the incentives were high enough. That violence, when redirected, could serve institutional goals. But what was rarely discussed was the cost. The normalization of figures like Barboza shifted the balance of power in investigations. Informants were no longer merely sources. They became architects of cases. Their narratives shaped prosecutorial strategies. Their motivations influenced targets. And when their testimony was flawed, the consequences multiplied. This evolution blurred accountability. Prosecutors could claim reliance on witnesses. Agencies could claim procedural compliance. Informants could claim survival. Responsibility fractured across layers of decision-making, leaving no single point of reckoning. Barboza's story illustrated this fragmentation perfectly. When his lies sent innocent men to prison, blame was diffuse. When his violence continued under protection, oversight was shared. When his instability escalated, intervention was delayed. Each failure was defensible in isolation. Together, they formed a systemic breakdown. Despite this, his cooperation was celebrated quietly within law enforcement circles. Awards were earned. Careers advanced. Conviction rates improved. The immediate metrics of success were undeniable. Organized crime in New England was weakened significantly. Leadership structures collapsed. Fear shifted. For many officials, this outcome justified the means. Publicly, Barboza was rarely discussed in detail. His name surfaced in court transcripts and investigative journalism, but there was no formal acknowledgement of the moral compromise involved. Instead, his case faded into institutional memory as a necessary evil. Uncomfortable, but effective, this framing would influence future decisions in later decades. Similar arrangements emerged across the country. Violent criminals were shielded in exchange for testimony. Informants with histories of abuse, murder, and coercion were granted leniency. Each time, the logic traced back to a familiar argument. We need them more than they need us. Barboza had proven that argument workable, at least in the short term. But long-term consequences began to surface as trust eroded. Communities questioned verdicts. Defense attorneys scrutinized informant deals more aggressively. Judges demanded greater disclosure. Skepticism grew. The system adapted, but unevenly. Some safeguards improved. Others remained cosmetic. The fundamental tension between truth and utility persisted. Barboza's case became a quiet reference point, not always named, but always present. Whenever agencies debated how far they were willing to go, get in this way. Joseph Barboza's legacy extended far beyond Boston. He reshaped investigative philosophy. He altered the moral calculus of cooperation, and he demonstrated that once boundaries are crossed, returning to restraint is far more difficult than abandoning it. Chapter 7 unfolds. The focus turns to the broader cultural impact of this shift. How Barboza's story influenced public perception, media narratives, and the enduring mythology of the gangster informant. Because while institutions moved on, the public never fully forgot, and the shadow of the animal continued to loom over every case where justice relied on the word of the killer. Chapter 7, Segment 2, The Public Reckoning. As Joseph Barboza's story slowly emerged beyond courtrooms and internal reports, it began to reshape how the public understood both organized crime and the justice system meant to dismantle it. What had once been a hidden arrangement between a violent informant and federal authorities became, over time, a symbol of something far more unsettling. The myth of the righteous takedown began to crack. For decades, popular narratives around organized crime had relied on a familiar structure. There were villains and heroes, criminals and lawmen. Violence existed on one side, justice on the other. Barboza disrupted that framework completely. Here was a man responsible for dozens of murders, protected by the government, rewarded for cooperation, and empowered to decide the fate of others. His story forced an uncomfortable realization into the open, that the fight against crime did not always look like justice from the inside. Media coverage played a crucial role in this reckoning. Investigative journalists began digging into Barboza's past, not just his crimes, but his cooperation agreements, his benefits, and the contradictions in his testimony. Articles surfaced questioning how much of his information had been verified. Books examined the human cost of his lies. Documentaries framed him as both executioner and witness. blurring moral lines viewers had long taken for granted. Public reaction was conflicted. Some saw Barboza as a necessary weapon, arguing that organized crime could not be defeated without using its own brutality against itself. Others viewed him as evidence of institutional rot, proof that the justice system was willing to sacrifice innocence for efficiency. Neither side found comfort. The debate exposed a deeper anxiety about power, about who gets to define truth, about whether justice is something absolute or something negotiated behind closed doors. Barboza's case did not offer answers. It only amplified questions. Families of the wrongfully convicted began speaking out more openly as public interest grew. Their stories added emotional weight to what had once been abstract legal concerns. They described lost decades, broken relationships, and the enduring stigma of convictions that remained on record even as doubts mounted. These voices complicated the narrative further. They made it impossible to view Barboza solely as a tool against the Mafia. They reframed him as an active participant in the destruction of innocent lives, enabled by institutions that valued results over restraint. Law enforcement agencies responded cautiously. Official statements emphasized historical context. They acknowledged mistakes without assigning responsibility. They highlighted reforms implemented since Barboza's era, stressing improved oversight and disclosure requirements. Yet skepticism lingered. Critics noted that many reforms were reactive rather than proactive, that accountability rarely extended beyond policy adjustments, that the individuals harmed by past failures were often left without meaningful remedy. The Barboza case became shorthand for a broader concern, that informant-driven justice carries inherent risks that cannot be fully neutralized by procedure. This concern extended into popular culture. Fictional portrayals of informants grew darker. Characters modeled loosely on figures like Barboza were depicted as manipulative, self-serving, and morally corrosive. The heroic informant trope faded, replaced by narratives emphasizing betrayal and unintended consequences. Even within law enforcement training, the tone shifted. Instructors referenced historical cases where informants distorted investigations. Barboza's story was not always named directly, but its lessons were unmistakable. Trainees were warned about confirmation bias, incentive structures, and the danger of letting outcomes justify ethical compromise. Still, the tension remained unresolved. Because informants continued to deliver results, they still cracked cases, they still dismantled networks, and the temptation to rely on them persisted. What Barboza's story ultimately did was remove innocence from the equation. It forced both the public and institutions to confront the reality that justice is often negotiated under pressure, shaped by imperfect actors, and vulnerable to abuse when oversight fails. This realization did not lead to outrage alone. It led to resignation, a quiet understanding that the system, while necessary, is not inherently virtuous, that it reflects the values it prioritizes, and that when fear and ambition outweigh accountability, figures like Joseph Barboza are not anomalies. They are inevitable. As Chapter 7 continues, the focus shifts to how this reckoning reshaped legal doctrine and investigative strategy, and how Barboza's shadow still influences decisions made in courtrooms today. Because even decades after his death, the questions he raised remain unanswered, and the discomfort he introduced has never fully faded. Chapter 7, Segment 3, The Shadow That Never Left. Long after Joseph Barboza's name faded from public memory, the consequences of his cooperation continued to shape the legal landscape in quieter, less visible ways. His story did not conclude with reforms or acknowledgments. Instead, it embedded itself into the fabric of criminal justice as an unspoken reference point, a cautionary presence that influenced decisions without ever being fully confronted in courtrooms across the country. Judges became more cautious when informant testimony formed the backbone of the case. Defense attorneys grew more aggressive in exposing incentive structures, benefits, and undisclosed agreements. Jurors were instructed with greater emphasis on skepticism, reminded that cooperation often comes with motives that complicate truth. These shifts did not happen overnight. They emerged gradually, shaped by accumulated discomfort rather than decisive reform. Barboza's case was rarely cited directly, but it hovered behind discussions about credibility, disclosure, and ethical limits. It became part of the institutional memory, a reminder of what happens when the pursuit of conviction eclipses the pursuit of truth. Yet for all the procedural changes, the core dilemma remained unresolved. Law enforcement still depended on insiders to penetrate criminal organizations. Prosecutors still faced pressure to deliver results. Informants were still flawed, incentivized, and unreliable in ways that no policy could fully correct. The Barboza story underscored a fundamental tension that no system has ever fully resolved: the need to extract truth from those most committed to deception. This tension created a kind of moral fatigue. Rather than confronting the implications directly, institutions learned to live with them. Informant programs continued, but with more paperwork. Oversight increased, but accountability remained diffuse. Failures were acknowledged selectively, framed as isolated rather than systemic. In this environment, Barboza's legacy became abstract. He was referenced in training materials, discussed in academic journals, mentioned in footnotes of appellate decisions. But the human cost, the men imprisoned, the families fractured, rarely occupied the center of these conversations. Abstraction made the story manageable. That IT allowed institutions to learn lessons without absorbing responsibility, to adapt without apologizing, to move forward without reckoning fully with the past. For the public, however, the discomfort lingered. Each new informant scandal reignited familiar doubts. Each revelation of undisclosed deals or false testimony echoed patterns established decades earlier. Trust, once fractured, never fully healed. Instead, it became conditional, granted cautiously, withdrawn quickly. Barboza's name resurfaced whenever those doubts reached a tipping point, not as a headline, but as a reference, the reminder, the warning. In this way, he achieved a kind of immortality he never sought, not as a hero or villain, but as a symbol of compromise. A figure who embodied the risks of allowing violent individuals to dictate narratives in the name of justice. His story resisted closure because it exposed something enduring, that systems designed by humans inherit human flaws. That power, when concentrated without accountability, distorts judgment. That violence does not become virtuous simply because it is repurposed. And perhaps most unsettling of all, that institutions often prefer manageable outcomes over uncomfortable truths. AS Chapter 7 closes, the focus turns toward the final reckoning, not of Joseph Barboza the man, but of Joseph Barboza the consequence, because his life demonstrated that the most lasting damage of corruption is not always visible in scandal or collapse. Sometimes it persists quietly, in altered standards, in lowered expectations, in the subtle normalization of compromise, and in the uneasy awareness that once a system accepts a figure like the animal as necessary, it can never fully return to innocence. Barboza may be gone, but the shadow he casts continues to shape how justice is pursued, questioned, and understood, long after the gunshots that ended his life faded into silence. Chapter 8, Segment 1, The Cost Paid by the Innocent. While Joseph Barboza's name became synonymous with violence and betrayal, the most enduring suffering tie to his cooperation did not belong to him. It belonged to people who never chose this story, never entered the underworld, and never benefited from the deal struck behind closed doors. Their lives were reshaped quietly, far from headlines, inside prison cells, and family homes emptied by absence. When Barboza began testifying for the government, his words carried extraordinary weight. Prosecutors presented him as a reformed insider, a man who had finally chosen truth over brutality. Jurors were told he was risking his life to testify. That framing mattered. It transformed a career killer into a credible narrator in the eyes of the court. But credibility built on convenience is fragile. Several men convicted on Barboza's testimony insisted from the beginning that his statements were false. They described alibis that were never investigated, witnesses who were never called, and timelines that made no sense when examined closely. At the time, these objections were dismissed as predictable denials from accused criminals. Years later, patterns began to emerge. Independent reviews revealed inconsistencies in Barboza's accounts. Dates shifted, locations changed. Confessions attributed to defendants could not be corroborated. In some cases, physical evidence contradicted his testimony entirely. Yet those contradictions had not stopped convictions. The justice system moved forward anyway. For prosecutors, Barboza represented efficiency. He delivered convictions quickly. He helped dismantle rival criminal networks. He provided a narrative that fit the government's theory of the case. Questioning him too deeply risked unraveling multiple prosecutions at once that SO doubts were minimized. Defense challenges were framed as distractions, and lives were altered permanently. Men sentenced to decades in prison watched their children grow up through visiting room glass. Families spent years appealing convictions, often without resources or legal support. Some lost faith entirely, not just in courts, but in the idea that truth mattered when power was involved. In a few cases, convictions were eventually overturned. Those moments came quietly, long after public attention had moved on. A judge acknowledged unreliable testimony. A prosecutor conceded procedural errors. A sentence was vacated, but freedom after decades behind bars is not restoration, but IT is disorientation. The world had changed. Families were gone. Opportunities had passed. And the psychological weight of being labeled a murderer for years did not vanish with a legal ruling. For others, exoneration never came at all. Their names remain in court records tied to crimes they maintained they did not commit. Their sentences served quietly, their protests unheard beyond prison walls. Barboza, meanwhile, lived under government protection, but he was moved. Paid, shielded, the imbalance was stark that a man who admitted to dozens of murders slept behind guarded doors, while men accused by him slept in cells built for punishment rather than protection. This contrast disturbed even some within law enforcement. Internal debates emerged about the ethics of relying so heavily on a witness with such a documented history of violence and deception. Yet those debates rarely resulted in action. The system had already invested too much in the outcomes he produced. Admitting error would mean confronting systemic failure. IT would mean acknowledging that the pursuit of justice had, at times, abandoned fairness entirely. So the story was reframed. Barboza became an unfortunate necessity. The innocent became collateral damage. And accountability dissolved into procedural complexity. As years passed, families of the wrongfully convicted carried the burden forward. They wrote letters, filed motions, spoke to journalists when given the chance. Their voices remained steady, but were often drowned out by institutional silence. For them, Barboza's legacy was not abstract or symbolic. IT was personal, IT was birthdays missed, that IT was parents who died before seeing their children free, that IT was the slow erosion of trust in a system that promised protection and delivered punishment instead. This chapter is not about Barboza's violence. That IT is about what happened when his words were allowed to outweigh evidence, when a system built away truth placed. It's faith in a man whose entire survival depended on deception. And as this chapter unfolds further, the focus shifts away from the hitman and toward those who paid the price for believing him. And the quiet question that lingers beneath every informant-driven case since. How many lives can be damaged before a system is forced to look at itself honestly? Chapter 8, Segment 2, A System That Looked Away. Long after the trials concluded and sentences were handed down, the deeper consequences of relying on Joseph Barboza began to surface in ways that could no longer be ignored. Not through a single revelation, but through a slow accumulation of doubt. File by file, transcript by transcript, case by case, that IT, the center of it all, was an uncomfortable realization. The justice system had not merely used a violent criminal to secure convictions. It had protected him while discouraging scrutiny of his claims. And in doing so, it had quietly reshaped its own standards of truth. When defense attorneys revisited cases tied to Barboza's testimony, they noticed something striking. Prosecutorial files often lack corroboration. Statements attributed to defendants were unsupported by recordings or witnesses. Timelines were accepted without challenge. In several instances, Barboza's testimony was the sole pillar holding an entire conviction in place. This was not standard practice. Normally, informant testimony was meant to supplement evidence, not replace it. But Barboza had been elevated beyond that role. His cooperation agreements granted him extraordinary latitude, and his value to federal investigations made him difficult to question. To challenge him was to challenge the cases he built, and to challenge those cases was to risk exposing institutional failure. The system resisted. Judges deferred to prosecutors. Prosecutors deferred to prior verdicts. Appeals courts emphasized procedural finality over factual reconsideration. The machinery of justice, once set in motion, became resistant to reversal. For families seeking answers, the process felt endless. Requests for evidentiary hearings were denied. Motions were dismissed as untimely. Claims of perjury were labeled speculative. Each rejection reinforced a painful pattern. The system that had moved swiftly to convict now moved painfully slow to reconsider. Inside law enforcement, discomfort grew quietly. Some agents questioned whether Barboza's handlers had crossed ethical boundaries. Internal memoranda hinted at concerns about coaching, selective disclosure, and the withholding of impeachment material. Yet these concerns rarely became public. They remained buried within agencies that preferred silence to scandal. Accountability required exposure. Exposure required courage, and courage was in short supply. What emerged instead was a culture of rationalization. Barboza's lies, when acknowledged at all, were framed as exaggerations rather than fabrications. His violence was described as unfortunate but necessary to infiltrate criminal networks. The innocent convictions tied to his testimony were dismissed as rare exceptions rather than systemic warnings. This framing mattered that IT allowed the system to preserve its self-image while minimizing harm. IT transformed moral failure into bureaucratic inconvenience, and it ensured that lessons went unlearned. Meanwhile, public trust eroded. Communities already wary of law enforcement viewed the Barboza revelations as confirmation of long-held suspicions. That justice was uneven. That power protected itself. That truth mattered less than outcomes. For some, the case became symbolic. not just of one informant's betrayal, but of a system willing to sacrifice individuals for institutional success. Yet even as criticism grew, reform remained elusive. Witness protection programs expanded rather than contracted. Informant deals became more sophisticated, not more restrained. Oversight mechanisms remained internal, insulated from public accountability. The logic was always the same. Without informants, organized crime could not be dismantled. Without deals, convictions would slow. Without shortcuts, results would suffer. And so the cycle continued. Barboza's legacy extended far beyond his own crimes or his eventual death. It lived on in legal precedents that favored expedience over verification, in prosecutorial strategies that prioritized narrative cohesion over contradiction, in courtrooms where informant testimony remained powerful despite its risks. For those wrongfully convicted, this legacy was devastating. Their suffering was not the result of a single bad actor, but of a system that enabled him repeatedly. A system that knew the risks and proceeded anyway. In quiet moments, some officials acknowledged this privately. They spoke of regret, of missed opportunities to intervene, of decisions made under pressure that looked different in hindsight. But regret without repair is hollow, and hindsight does not restore years lost. As this chapter deepens, the story moves closer to its most troubling truth. That Joseph Barboza did not corrupt the system on his own, that he revealed what it was already willing to tolerate. And in the silence that followed, that tolerance became policy. Chapter 8, Segment 3, The Price of Winning. By the time Joseph Barboza's role in federal investigations was fully understood, the damage had already settled into place. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, in records that could not be undone and lives that could not be restored. This was the cost of winning at any price. The federal cases built on Barboza's testimony were often celebrated as major victories against organized crime. Headlines focused on convictions, on dismantled crews, on the symbolic collapse of the New England Mafia's power structure. From the outside, the strategy appeared effective. Inside the system, however, a different story lingered. Investigators began to recognize that success had been measured narrowly. Convictions were counted, but consequences were not. The long-term implications of empowering a man like Barboza were rarely discussed when the deals were signed. Each agreement was treated as an isolated transaction, detached from the broader moral and legal framework. Barboza exploited this isolation expertly. He understood that as long as he remained useful, his credibility would be protected. That prosecutors would hesitate to expose weaknesses in cases they had already won. That law enforcement agencies would prioritize continuity over correction. He learned how to speak the language of cooperation, that he learned how to provide just enough truth to mask the lies. And he learned that once a narrative was accepted by the courts, it became remarkably difficult to dismantle. Years later, when investigative journalists and legal scholars revisited the record, patterns emerged that were impossible to ignore. Barboza's statements often evolved over time. Details shifted, timelines adjusted, names appeared and disappeared depending on strategic need. Yet these inconsistencies rarely triggered alarms when they occurred. They were smoothed over, explained away, or ignored entirely. The pressure to maintain momentum was constant. Organized crime investigations required funding, political support, and public confidence. Acknowledging flaws in a central informant risked all three. And so the system chose stability over scrutiny. This choice had consequences beyond individual cases. IT normalized the idea that informants could be managed rather than verified. That credibility was negotiable. That truth could be flexible as long as outcomes aligned with institutional goals. Over time, these attitudes spread. Younger prosecutors learned from precedent. Investigators adopted similar strategies. Informant-driven cases became more aggressive, more insulated, and less transparent. Barboza's model, intentionally or not, became a blueprint. For victims of wrongful conviction, this was devastating. Their attempts to reopen cases often encountered resistance rooted not in evidence, but in institutional fear. Fear of precedent, fear of exposure, fear of unraveling years of work. Every challenge threatened to pull on a thread that could unravel far more than one conviction. And so the system held tight. The irony was stark. Joseph Barboza had been portrayed as a necessary evil, a monster unleashed temporarily to destroy greater monsters. Yet in protecting him, the system absorbed some of his methods. Secrecy, manipulation, control through fear of consequences. What was meant to be an exception quietly became acceptable practice. As time passed, Barboza himself faded from public memory. His name became a footnote, his story summarized in a few lines of legal history. But the structures he influenced remained intact. The witness protection program continued to grow. Informant agreements became more complex. Oversight mechanisms remained largely internal. External accountability, when it appeared, was limited and slow. In private conversations, some officials admitted what could not be said publicly. That the line between justice and expedience had blurred. That safeguards had failed. That the system had trusted too much and questioned too little. But admissions without action changed nothing. The legal system is built on precedent. And precedent, once established, carries weight long after its originators are gone. Barboza's cooperation agreements, the court rulings that upheld them, and the convictions that followed all contributed to a framework that would shape future cases, but a framework where outcomes mattered more than process. Where informants were assets first, risks second. Where correcting errors was more dangerous than ignoring them. This chapter is not about one man's crimes. That IT is about what happens when institutions prioritize victory over integrity. When shortcuts are rewarded, when uncomfortable truths are postponed indefinitely. Joseph Barboza did not just expose corruption within the FBI and the justice system, but he demonstrated how easily power can justify itself, and how difficult it becomes to reclaim accountability once that justification is accepted. As the story moves forward, the focus shifts to the final reckoning. Not just of Barboza's life, but the legacy he left behind. That a legacy written not only in blood, but in silence. Chapter 9, Segment 1, Cracks in the Story. Long after Joseph Barboza was removed from the streets, long after his testimony had reshaped the legal landscape of organized crime in New England, questions that once felt inconvenient began to surface with greater clarity. They did not arrive loudly, they arrived slowly. In footnotes, in appeals, in quiet conversations between defense attorneys who noticed patterns that no longer made sense. That first, these cracks were easy to dismiss. Every large case, especially those built on informants, carries imperfections, minor inconsistencies, memory lapses, human error. That explanation had been enough for years. But Barboza's cases were different. The inconsistencies were not minor. They were structural. Timelines did not align across testimonies. Events described in court contradicted physical evidence documented elsewhere. In some trials, Barboza appeared to be in two places at once, committing acts separated by impossible distances within implausible windows of time. Initially, these contradictions were attributed to stress or faulty recollection. Barboza, after all, had lived a chaotic and violent life. Expecting precision from someone like him seemed unreasonable. Yet the deeper investigators looked, the more the same issues repeated. Names of accomplices changed between statements. Details that strengthened the prosecution appeared suddenly after plea negotiations. Crimes Barboza had previously denied involvement and became confessions when cooperation benefits were on the line. And most troubling of all, independent corroboration was often missing. In several cases, Barboza's word stood almost entirely alone. Defense attorneys who attempted to challenge this reliance encountered formidable resistance. Prosecutors defended their witness aggressively. Judges, wary of reopening settled cases, often limited the scope of inquiry. Appeals were denied on procedural grounds rather than factual ones. The system was protecting itself. This protection did not necessarily require conspiracy. It relied instead on inertia, on the belief that revisiting old cases would undermine public confidence, on the fear that exposing one wrongful conviction could lead to dozens more. For years, that fear prevailed, but pressure continued to build. Investigative journalists began reviewing trial transcripts. Scholars examined patterns across Barboza's testimonies. Civil rights advocates raised concerns about the unchecked power of informants who were both perpetrators and accusers. Gradually, the narrative shifted. Joseph Barboza was no longer viewed solely as a brutal hitman turned whistleblower. He became a case study in systemic failure, a symbol of what happens when law enforcement depends too heavily on individuals whose incentives are fundamentally misaligned with truth. The public response was mixed. Some argued that even if Barboza had lied about certain details, the men convicted were criminals regardless. That justice, while imperfect, had still been served. That the dismantling of the New England Mafia justified the means. Others disagreed. They pointed out that justice is not defined by outcome alone. That imprisoning the guilty does not excuse imprisoning the innocent. That a system willing to accept false testimony risks becoming indistinguishable from the criminal organizations it seeks to destroy. These debates exposed a deeper discomfort. The idea that the justice system could knowingly rely on a serial killer's word without rigorous verification challenged foundational beliefs about fairness and due process. It forced uncomfortable questions about accountability. Who bears responsibility when an informant lies? The informant who benefits? The prosecutor who presents the testimony? The agents who facilitate the deal? Or the system that rewards results above all else? No single answer emerged. Instead, responsibility diffused across institutions, making it difficult to assign blame or enact reform. Each actor could point to another, each decision justified by context, each failure framed as unavoidable. Barboza himself was no longer available to interrogate, be why the time's serious scrutiny intensified. He was dead. Murdered in California under circumstances that raised questions of their own, but yielded few definitive answers. His voice, once central to dozens of prosecutions, had gone silent. What remained were documents, cold transcripts, signed agreements, convictions that could not easily be undone. Families of those convicted continued to seek answers. Some pursued appeals. Others settled for acknowledgement rather than exoneration. Many received neither. The legal system moved forward, but the past lingered. That Barboza's story became a cautionary tale taught in law schools and cited in policy discussions. His name surfaced in debates about informant reliability and ethical boundaries. His legacy influenced reforms, albeit slowly and unevenly. Yet for all the discussion, one reality persisted. The men he helped convict lived with sentences shaped by his words, and the system that empowered him never fully reckoned with the cost of that empowerment. This chapter marks the moment when certainty gave way to doubt, when victories were re-examined, when silence was no longer sufficient, and when the story of Joseph, the animal Barboza, shifted from one of ruthless effectiveness to one of unresolved consequence. The next segment moves deeper into that reckoning. Chapter 9, Segment 2, The Innocent Man. As doubts surrounding Joseph Barboza's testimony grew louder, attention slowly shifted away from Barboza himself and toward the men whose lives had been irreversibly altered by his words. These were not abstract legal debates. They were human stories. Men who had entered courtrooms in the 1960s and 1970s believing the system would weigh evidence carefully. Men who left those courtrooms in handcuffs, sentenced to decades behind bars, some to death row, largely on the strength of Barboza's testimony. For years, they had been invisible. Their names rarely appeared in headlines. Their appeals were quietly denied. Their families aged while waiting for justice that never arrived. Only when Barboza's credibility came under scrutiny did these cases resurface. Defense attorneys began reopening old files, often discovering that Barboza's testimony had been treated as mere sacred truth. In trial after trial, juries were told that while Barboza was a killer, he was now cooperating and therefore reliable. Prosecutors emphasized his insider status, his knowledge of the underworld, his supposed willingness to tell the truth at great personal risk. What was rarely emphasized was how much he stood to gain that Barboza's deals were extraordinary. Reduced sentences, immunity from prosecution for numerous murders, relocation, protection, a new identity, benefits that few informants before or since would ever receive. These incentives created a powerful motivation to please his handlers. In several cases, defense teams later discovered that Barboza's testimony had evolved over time. Initial statements given to investigators were vague or incomplete. Only after negotiations intensified did specific accusations emerge, often implicating individuals already known to law enforcement. In some instances, corroborating witnesses were never produced. Physical evidence was thin or non-existent. Yet convictions followed. One of the most disturbing aspects was how courts responded when these issues were raised years later. Appeals courts frequently acknowledged concerns but declined to overturn convictions. The reasoning was procedural rather than moral. Evidence rules had been followed at the time. Jurors had been informed of Barboza's criminal background. Prosecutors had technically disclosed his deals. From a legal standpoint, the boxes had been checked. From a human standpoint, the outcome felt hollow. Families of the convicted men described decades of frustration. Letters unanswered, hearings postponed, promises of review that led nowhere. For them, Barboza was not a complex figure or a historical case study. He was the reason their husbands, fathers, and sons disappeared into prison systems that offered little hope of release. Some inmates maintained their innocence to the end. Others admitted involvement in lesser crimes, but denied the murders Barboza attributed to them. In a system unwilling to separate degrees of guilt, nuance was irrelevant. The psychological toll was immense. Living under a sentence shaped by false testimony corrodes identity. It fractures trust. It turns time into an enemy. Several men died in prison before their cases could be reconsidered, their names quietly fading without vindication. Those who survived faced another cruel reality. Even when doubts about Barboza's testimony became widely accepted, exoneration remained elusive. Courts hesitated to reopen cases that could expose systemic failure. Prosecutors feared precedent. Law enforcement agencies resisted narratives that portrayed them as complicit in injustice. The truth was inconvenient. Acknowledging that innocent men had been imprisoned meant confronting uncomfortable questions about institutional responsibility. It meant admitting that the pursuit of organized crime convictions had sometimes eclipsed the pursuit of justice. For many years, silence was easier. Public opinion remained divided. Some argued that in the chaotic era of Mafia violence, mistakes were inevitable. That Barboza's lies, if they existed, were a small price to pay for dismantling criminal empires. Others rejected that calculus entirely. They argued that justice cannot be selective, that protecting society from organized crime does not require sacrificing innocent lives, that the legitimacy of the justice system depends on its willingness to correct its own errors, that Barboza's role complicated these debates. He was both monster and instrument, both criminal and tool of the state. His testimony blurred the line between law enforcement and law-breaking, creating a gray zone where ethical standards weakened. For the innocent men caught in that zone, the distinction was meaningless. They lost years that could never be returned. Relationships eroded. Health declined. Lives narrowed to concrete walls and scheduled routines. Even when some received reduced sentences or parole, the stigma remained. The label of murderer followed them into freedom, unsupported by truth, but reinforced by record. As more information emerged, journalists began telling these stories. Documentaries revisited the trials. Law reviews analyzed the failures. Slowly, public awareness grew, but awareness did not equal resolution. Most convictions tied to Barboza's testimony still stand today. An sweeping review was conducted. No formal apology issued. No systematic compensation offered. The machinery of justice, once set in motion, proved resistant to reversal. Barboza's legacy, then, is not only measured in the criminals he helped convict, but in the innocent lives damaged along the way. His cooperation brought down powerful figures, but also exposed how easily truth can be distorted when incentives favor results over accuracy. This segment ends not with closure, but with unease. Because the story of Joseph Barboza is not only about one violent and it is about a system willing to trust him and the quiet suffering of those who paid the price for that trust. The next segment examines how these revelations reshaped public confidence in the FBI itself. Chapter 9, Segment 3, Trust Broken. As the full scope of Joseph Barboza's cooperation became public, the damage extended far beyond individual cases. What began as questions about one informant slowly evolved into a broader crisis of confidence, one that reached into courtrooms, federal agencies, and the public's faith in justice itself. For decades, the FBI had presented itself as the final bulwark against organized crime. Its methods were secretive by design, its informants protected by necessity. But Barboza's story forced an uncomfortable reckoning. What happens when secrecy shields not justice, but wrongdoing? Internal FBI documents revealed patterns that were difficult to dismiss as isolated mistakes. Supervisors had approved extraordinary protections. Prosecutors had relied heavily on testimony they knew was compromised. Warnings from defense attorneys and even some judges had been quietly ignored. The problem was no longer just Barboza. It was the system that elevated him. Congressional inquiries and journalistic investigations began asking questions that have long gone unanswered. How many convictions had relied on informants with incentives to lie? How often had agents prioritized convictions over accuracy? And how many lives had been collateral damage in the war against the Mafia? The FBI responded cautiously. Official statements emphasized context. The era had been violent. Organized crime had exerted immense control. Informants were dangerous but necessary tools. Without men like Barboza, they argued, dismantling criminal empires would have been impossible. But critics pushed back. They pointed out that necessity does not erase responsibility. That extraordinary power requires extraordinary restraint. That law enforcement cannot claim moral authority while enabling perjury and protecting killers. Legal scholars examined Barboza's cases alongside others from the same period, identifying a troubling pattern. Informants were often rewarded before their claims were fully corroborated. Once a narrative was established, contradictory evidence was minimized. Careers advanced on the strength of high-profile convictions, not careful truth-finding. In this environment, skepticism became inconvenient. Whistleblowers within the justice system describe subtle pressures. Questioning an informant's reliability could be seen as disloyal. Raising ethical concerns risked isolation. Silence, once again, was easier. Public reaction was conflicted. Some viewed the revelations as proof that the justice system was fundamentally flawed. Others saw them as unfortunate but necessary compromises in an imperfect world. The debate exposed a deep divide between those who valued outcomes and those who valued process. For victims of organized crime, emotions were especially complex. Many had lost loved ones to mob violence. For them, Barboza's cooperation had delivered a sense of accountability that might never have existed otherwise. Acknowledging the cost of that cooperation did not erase its perceived benefits. Yet for the families of the wrongfully convicted, the equation looked very different. They asked why their suffering was acceptable, why their losses were treated as regrettable footnotes rather than central injustices, why correcting these wrongs seemed less urgent than celebrating convictions. These questions lingered without satisfying answers. Over time, reforms were proposed. Guidelines for informant use became more explicit. Disclosure requirements expanded. Courts demanded greater transparency about deals and incentives. But these changes came slowly, shaped by caution rather than urgency. Barboza himself had long since faded from public view, his violent life ending far from Boston. But his influence endured, embedded in legal precedents and institutional memory, in law schools. His case became a cautionary example. In training programs, it served as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked informant reliance. In public discourse, it symbolized the uneasy balance between security and justice. Yet symbols do not heal wounds. For many affected families, the passage of time brought neither clarity nor closure. Appeals stalled. Records remained sealed. Accountability was diffuse, spread across agencies and decades, making responsibility difficult to assign. The most enduring consequence of Barboza's story may be its erosion of trust. Trust that testimony is truthful. Trust that prosecutors seek justice rather than wins. Trust that federal agencies are guided by principles rather than expediency. Once broken, that trust proved hard to restore. Even today, discussions of informant-driven cases often reference Barboza as a warning. His name surfaces whenever questions arise about credibility, incentives, and moral compromise. He is remembered not only as a killer or an informant or a historical figure. He is remembered as a fracture at a moment when the justice system's reflection revealed uncomfortable truths about itself. And in that reflection, many saw something unsettling, not an isolated failure, but a vulnerability that still exists. As this chapter closes, the story turns toward its final reckoning. How Barboza's legacy continues to shape conversations about power, corruption, and the cost of justice in America. In the final chapter, we confront what remains unresolved and what lessons, if any, were truly learned. Chapter 10, Segment 1. What remains? Long after the headlines faded and courtrooms emptied, the story of Joseph, the animal Barboza, did not end. It settled, quietly, uneasily, like something unresolved that lingers at the edges of memory. In the years following his death, Barboza became less a man and more case study. His name appeared in law reviews, investigative books, and internal memos. Not as a celebrated informant, not as a reformed criminal, but as a warning, a reference point for what happens when institutions abandon restraint in pursuit of results. The Mafia he helped dismantle did not vanish overnight. Power shifted, names changed, crews splintered and reformed. But the era of unchecked dominance that once defined New England organized crime slowly eroded. On paper, this outcome justified the methods used. The FBI had weakened an entrenched criminal network. Prosecutors had secured convictions that once seemed impossible. And yet, beneath those outcomes, unresolved questions persisted. Was it acceptable to empower a man like Barboza? Could justice truly be served when built on the words of someone so deeply invested in deception? And where, exactly, should the line be drawn between necessary compromise and moral collapse? These questions did not fade with time. If anything, they grew louder as new cases emerged across the country. Defense attorneys increasingly challenged informant testimony. Judges demanded clearer disclosures. Juries were asked to weigh not just evidence, but motive. The shadow of Barboza hovered over these proceedings, a reminder of how easily truth can be distorted when incentives are misaligned. Within federal agencies, quiet reassessments took place. Training manuals evolved. Oversight committees expanded their reach. Language around informants shifted from asset-focused to risk-aware. None of this erased the past, but it reflected an institutional acknowledgement that something had gone wrong. Still, reform moved slowly. Part of the difficulty lay in accountability. The decisions that protected Barboza were spread across years, offices, and individuals. Responsibility was diluted by bureaucracy. No single agent or prosecutor could be isolated as the sole architect of a failure. And without clear accountability, consequences remained limited. For the wrongfully convicted, this offered little comfort. Some eventually regained their freedom. Others did not live long enough to see their names cleared. Families carried the weight of decades lost, knowing that their suffering was not an unintended accident, but a foreseeable outcome of choices made in secret. These stories rarely commanded the same attention as mob takedowns or courtroom victories. They unfolded quietly, often without cameras or applause, but they represented the most human cost of Barboza's legacy. Meanwhile, popular culture continued to mythologize the era. Films and television shows portrayed informants as clever survivors, criminals who outplayed both sides. Violence was stylized. Consequences were simplified. The complexity of real lives was compressed into dramatic arcs. Barboza's reality did not fit neatly into those narratives. He was not redeemed by cooperation. He did not escape the gravity of his actions. His death, far from the streets where he once wielded power, was unceremonious. There were no crowds, no final statements, just an end that mirrored the isolation he had lived with for years. That I end this way. His story resisted closure, because closure implies resolution. And nothing about Barboza's life offered that. His cooperation exposed corruption, but also embodied it. His testimony dismantled criminal structures, but also corrupted the pursuit of truth. His existence forced institutions to confront their own contradictions. Even now, decades later, debates about informant use often circle back to the same uncomfortable reality. There are no clean solutions when dealing with extraordinary violence. Law enforcement continues to rely on insiders. Criminal organizations continue to exploit loyalty and fear. And the justice system continues to navigate the narrow space between pragmatism and principle. Barboza's name surfaces in that space like a marker, not as a lesson fully learned, not as a mistake fully corrected, but as evidence that power, once granted, rarely remains contained. As this final chapter begins, the focus shifts away from the man himself and toward what his story demands of us now. Not admiration, not condemnation alone, but reflection, because the true measure of a justice system is not how effectively it punishes its enemies, but how carefully it protects its integrity while doing so. And in the wake of Joseph Barboza, that measure remains deeply unsettled. Chapter 10, Segment 2, Lessons Without Comfort. If there is a lesson in the life of Joseph, the animal Barboza, it is not a simple one. It does not resolve neatly. It does not offer reassurance. Instead, it lingers as an unease, an awareness that systems built to protect society can, under certain pressures, drift far from their intended purpose. For law enforcement, Barboza's case became a reference point that was rarely spoken aloud, but often felt. Agents who came after inherited procedures shaped by his era. Informant handling grew more formal. Paper trails became thicker. Approvals multiplied. None of this eliminated risk, but it acknowledged it. Still, the fundamental dilemma remained unchanged. To penetrate violent criminal organizations, authorities often rely on violent people. Those people come with histories, motives, and appetites that cannot be switched off at will. Cooperation does not erase character. It merely redirects it, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes disastrously. Barboza understood this better than anyone, that he knew the value of information in a system desperate for results. He knew how fear could be weaponized, how stories could be shaped, how urgency could override skepticism. He learned quickly that credibility was not earned through truth alone, but through usefulness. And he was useful. This realization sits at the heart of the discomfort his story creates. Barboza was not an anomaly who slipped through unnoticed. He was recognized, evaluated, and accepted with full knowledge of who he was. His violence was not a secret. It was calculated into the equation. That equation valued outcomes, convictions, headlines, the appearance of control. In doing so, it accepted collateral damage as inevitable. For those wrongfully imprisoned, this framing felt especially hollow. Their lives became statistical footnotes, rationalized as unfortunate but necessary. The language of necessity provided distance, allowing institutions to grieve abstractly while individuals suffered concretely. Over time, some officials privately expressed regret. Memos surfaced acknowledging errors in judgment. Retired agents spoke more freely, admitting that lines had been crossed. But regret did not undo years lost, nor did it restore trust once broken. Public faith in the justice system relies on an assumption of fairness. When that assumption fractures, skepticism grows. Communities begin to question not just outcomes, but intentions. The Barboza revelations fed that skepticism, particularly in neighborhoods already wary of authority. In Boston, the scars were deep. The city had lived under the weight of organized crime for decades. Residents understood fear intimately. When a mob's grip loosened, relief was real. But learning that relief came at the expense of truth complicated that relief. It introduced doubt into what had seemed like progress. The legal system struggled to address this complexity. Courts are designed to adjudicate individual cases, not moral landscapes. They can overturn convictions, order new trials, issue apologies. But they cannot fully reconcile the emotional contradictions left behind when justice and injustice coexist. That Barboza's case forced that coexistence into view. 8 years passed. His name receded from public consciousness, resurfacing only in specialized discussions or historical accounts. Yet the structures influenced by his cooperation persisted. Informant programs continued. Plea bargains remained common. Prosecutorial discretion retained immense power. What changed was awareness. Defense attorneys became more aggressive in exposing informant incentives. Judges demanded clearer disclosures. Jurors were instructed to consider credibility with greater caution. These shifts did not eliminate reliance on insiders, but they tempered it with scrutiny. Still, scrutiny depends on transparency, and transparency remains uneven. Barboza's story highlights how secrecy, while sometimes necessary, can also shield misconduct. It shows how noble goals can be compromised by expedient choices, and it demonstrates how once those choices are embedded in institutional practice, they become difficult to unravel. There is no comfort in these realizations. They do not offer a villain easily isolated, nor a hero easily celebrated. They instead suggest a system perpetually negotiating with its own limits. In this sense, Barboza's legacy is not confined to his actions. It extends into the ongoing tension between effectiveness and ethics, between winning cases and preserving integrity, between the urgent need to stop violence and the equally urgent need to uphold truth. As the narrative moves towards conclusion, one truth becomes clear. The consequences of Barboza's cooperation cannot be measured solely by convictions secured or crimes prevented. They must also be measured by the questions his story continues to ask. Questions about power, about accountability, and about what society is willing to accept in the name of safety. These questions do not demand immediate answers. They demand vigilance. Because as long as the systems Barboza exploited continue to exist, so too does the possibility of repetition. And that possibility, more than any single crime, is what makes his story endure. Chapter 10, Segment 3, The Quiet Reckoning. When the story of Joseph, the animal Barboza, is finally set down, what remains is not a verdict, but a reckoning that never fully arrives. There is no single moment when the balance is restored. No closing statement that settles the weight of what was done in secret. Instead, the reckoning unfolds slowly in fragments across years and across lives that were permanently altered. That Barboza's life ended violently, as many predicted it would. But his death did not conclude the damage he left behind. It did not repair the trust that had been eroded. It did not answer the questions raised by a system that chose expedience over restraint. If anything, his absence made those questions harder to confront, because the focus shifted away from the man and toward the structures that empowered him. Those structures remain. Law enforcement agencies continue to rely on informants. Courts continue to weigh testimony shaped by incentives. Prosecutors continue to negotiate deals with individuals whose credibility is compromised by their own self-interest. These realities are not unique to Barboza's era. They are embedded in the architecture of modern criminal justice. What Barboza exposed was not merely corruption, but a vulnerability rooted in urgency, in fear, in the pressure to deliver results when violence threatens to overwhelm communities. Under those conditions, lines blur. Shortcuts appear justified. Warnings become inconvenient, and extraordinary measures begin to feel ordinary. Barboza thrived in that environment, that he understood how systems respond to pressure. He recognized that information could outweigh morality, that usefulness could eclipse accountability, and that once an institution commits to a narrative, it becomes resistant to anything that threatens it. This understanding gave him leverage far beyond his rank as a criminal. It allowed him to manipulate outcomes without ever appearing in public view. It allowed him to shape destinies from behind sealed files and closed doors. The people most affected by this leverage were rarely those in power. They were defendants who lacked resources, families who trusted the courts, communities who believed that the pursuit of justice would not sacrifice truth along the way. When that belief fractured, the consequences were subtle but profound. cynicism replaced confidence. Silence replaced cooperation. The distance between institutions and the public widened. These are costs that do not appear in sentencing reports or annual budgets. They cannot be quantified easily, yet they linger long after cases are closed. In the years since Barboza's story became widely known, efforts to rebuild trust have continued in small, incremental ways. Oversight has expanded. Disclosure standards have improved. Conversations about ethics have become more explicit. None of this suggests a system transformed, but it does suggest a system aware of its own fragility. Awareness, however, is only the beginning. The deeper challenge lies in maintaining vigilance when memories fade, when new threats emerge, when pressure returns and old habits tempt decision makers to repeat familiar patterns. Barboza's case warns how easily that repetition can occur when urgency outweighs reflection. IT also reminds us that justice is not defined solely by the defeat of criminals, that IT is defined by how power is exercised, by whether truth is treated as a foundation or convenience, by whether institutions hold themselves to the same standards they demand of others. Barboza failed those standards as an individual. That much is clear, but his story asks whether the systems that enabled him fully confronted their own failures. There is no definitive answer. Instead, there is an ongoing responsibility to question, to examine, to resist the comfort of simple narratives, to remember that effectiveness without ethics carries a cost that may not be immediately visible, but is always eventually paid. In this sense, Joseph Barboza did more than expose corruption within the New England Mafia. He exposed the tension at the heart of justice itself. The tension between safety and principle, between secrecy and accountability, between winning and being right. That tension did not end with him. IT persists quietly, in courtrooms and offices, in policies and practices, waiting to be tested again. Whether it will be handled differently next time depends not on history alone, but on the willingness to learn from it. And that ultimately is the final legacy of Joseph the Animal Barboza. Not a story meant to shock, not a caution confined to the past, but a reminder, spoken softly but insistently, that power demands restraint and that without it, justice risks becoming indistinguishable from the violence it claims to oppose. Joseph the Animal Barboza lived a life built on fear, violence, and manipulation. He was a killer who found protection, a criminal who gained power not through loyalty or honor, but through usefulness. And when that usefulness ended, so did any illusion of control he once held. His story forces us to sit with uncomfortable truths. That justice can be bent by desperation. That institutions meant to protect the public can, at times, protect the wrong people. And that the line between stopping crime and enabling it is thinner than we often want to believe. Barboza helped dismantle a brutal criminal empire. But in doing so, he exposed fractures within the system itself. Fractures that allowed lies to pass as truth and violence to hide behind authority. The damage left behind cannot be measured only in convictions or collapsed crime families, but in lives altered quietly, far from headlines. This is not a story with a clean ending. There is no moment where everything balances out, only the lingering weight of choices made in secrecy, and a reminder that power, once misused, leaves echoes long after the noise fades. If this story stayed with you tonight, take a moment to reflect on it, on what justice means, on who it protects, and on the responsibility that comes with believing someone simply because the system tells us to. Thank you for listening. And when you're ready, we'll return with another story, spoken softly, told carefully, and remembered long after the lights go out.